The night comes first, thick, airless, and strangely warm. I feel it before I wake. The heat pressing against the wooden beams above me, the faint tremble in my mattress, the way my breath catches as if someone has placed a hand over my mouth. Outside, London lies quiet beneath a low Tudor sky, but there's a sickly stillness in the air, the kind that makes every candle sputter with unease. By the time I sit up, sweat is already running down my spine, not fever, not exertion, something else, something moving through the streets long before dawn. They say everyone goes to bed healthy. They say no one sees it coming. And yet all across the city tonight, shutters rattle, dogs bark at nothing, and mothers sit awake listening for the first cough that means their world is about to break apart. Even the constables feel it, this strange, invisible weight sliding beneath door frames and under rafters like a silent tide. No one speaks it aloud, but everyone knows the English sweat is back. A sickness that kills in hours, not days. A terror so sudden and cruel the Tudors tried to bury the memory of it. So settle in with me. Breathe slowly. Let the room grow dim. Tonight we sink into the forgotten summer when England burned from the inside, when heat meant horror, when sweat meant death, and when an entire kingdom learned how fragile a heartbeat truly was. Subscribe and stay with me. There are more shadows to follow, more Tudor rooms to enter, and more nights when the air itself feels haunted. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The past is never as distant as it seems. The heat rose before the sun did, not the soft warmth of summer, but something heavier, something that pressed against rooftops and seeped into the beams of every Tudor house, as though the night itself had been holding its breath. London lay still beneath it, pinned beneath a sky the colour of dying embers, and in that uneasy darkness the city felt strangely alive. The air moved in slow, unnatural waves, brushing against shutters and slipping under door frames with the quiet certainty of something searching for its name. Chimneys that should have been cold at this hour glowed faintly, as though the heat had climbed up through their stone throats during the night. The timbered walls of Cheapside sweated with moisture, beads forming along their plaster seams like fear brought to the surface. Rats scurried along their usual paths, yet even they paused from time to time as if listening for something beneath the familiar hum of the waking city. Nothing moved quickly. Everything seemed to hesitate before daring the next breath. Inside one cramped house near Bishopsgate, a woman stirred awake, not to the crow of roosters or the rattle of carts, but to the strange weight of warm air on her eyelids. She pushed the blanket aside, only to find her nightdress clinging damply to her back. A murmur escaped her, half confusion, half dread, when she noticed the room's placed, single candle bending as though caught in an invisible draught. The flame trembled, fat droplets of wax sliding down its side like tears. She touched her forehead. It felt normal, and yet something inside her whispered that the heat was not. Across London, others woke the same way slowly, with a quiet dread they could not name. Bakers felt the ovens crackle before fire even touched them. Butchers noticed the scent of meat turning too quickly in the air. Merchants opened their shutters and stepped back at once, struck by the stifling breath of the street. Even the Thames, usually cool at dawn, exhaled a warm fog that drifted low over the water like a shroud. And in that fog, the city seemed to watch itself. The bells of St. Sepulchre tolled their usual morning call, but the sound felt warped, thickened, as if the air itself was swallowing the echo. A boy fetching water paused at the riverbank, watching ripples form where no boat had passed. Above him, gulls circled lower than usual, wings barely moving, as though even they feared the strange heaviness settling over the capital. No one saw the first man stumble in the street. Not yet. That would come as the day wore on, when the heat stopped feeling natural and the sweat began to pour in terrifying torrents. But in these first moments, in this eerie dawn, London held its breath. People exchanged wary glances over wash basins and chamber pots, each wondering if this was merely an odd morning or the beginning of something darker. London had survived fires, rebellions, and whispers of plague. But this silent change in the air, this invisible hand brushing across the city's skin, felt different. It felt intimate. It felt like London was being touched by something that knew exactly where to press. And as the sun finally broke over the rooftops, thick and red like a bleeding wound on the horizon, the city understood what it meant to fear the morning. Because the English sweat always began with heat, and heat had arrived before dawn. The house on Mincing Lane had always creaked, but on this night the wood seemed to whisper outright long, aching murmurs that drifted through the rafters like restless spirits testing the strength of the beams. It was a modest home, narrow and leaning slightly as though weary from decades of fog and soot. Yet even the familiar decay felt different now, coated in a damp heaviness that clung to the walls the way fever clings to skin. Inside, no one slept, not really. They only lay still, pretending. Master Harrow was the first to stir, though he had never fully surrendered to slumber. His eyes snapped open in the dark, aware of the same pressure that had woken countless others across the city. The heat, it wrapped around him like a damp cloth, suffocating in a way no summer warmth ever had. He pressed a palm to his sternum, feeling each breath drag through his chest, as if the air had gained weight during the night. At the foot of the bed, his wife tossed beneath the linen, turning, her face away from the oppressive warmth that radiated from the walls. Her hair stuck to her temple. A single bead of sweat ran from her brow to her jaw before slipping onto the pillow. She shivered despite the heat. Master Harrow watched her for a moment, uneasy. She was not normally one to wake so early. Beyond their room, the house held its breath. Their oldest daughter, Alice, sat upright on her straw mattress, arms wrapped around her knees. She had woken to the sound of something shifting in the lower hall. No footsteps, no knocking, just a soft groan of timber, reverberating like the house itself was trying to inhale. She listened to it, feeling her heartbeat quicken. When the sound finally faded, she almost wished it hadn't. Silence felt more threatening than noise. In the next room, the youngest, Thomas, whimpered in half-sleep, twisting under his thin blanket. The heat made his skin glisten. He dreamed of running down alleys, through markets, across bridges, but whatever he fled seemed to follow him with slow, patient certainty. His breath rasped in his throat, too shallow for comfort. A nightmare, his mother would later assure herself. Only a nightmare. The hearth downstairs had long gone cold, yet the stones surrounding it radiated warmth as though embers hid deep in the brickwork. A copper pan left out from the evening meal felt warmer than it should when touched. The air, normally cool before dawn, now hovered thick and stagnant in every corner, smelling faintly of iron and wet wool. It was a heat without origin, without flame and intruder. Master Harrow rose at last, his bare feet landing on the floorboards with a dull thud. The wood felt warm beneath his soles. He frowned down at it, unsure whether he should attribute this to his imagination or something far more troubling. He lit a candle, shielding the flame from the sluggish air that pressed against it. The wick sputtered, struggling, as though resisting its own ignition. He crossed the hall, every sound dampened. No night breeze slipped through the cracks, no cool breath from under the door. It felt as though the house was sealed in hot glass. When he reached the landing window and wiped the condensation with the side of his hand, he expected to see the city shrouded in fog, but instead he found the street empty and unnervingly still, bathed in a faint red glow from the horizon where the sun had yet to breach. Alice appeared behind him without warning, her face pale in the candlelight. "Father, is it morning already?" He hesitated. "Not yet, but something's changed." She nodded once too quickly and backed away, clutching her arms. She didn't want to voice the fear crawling up her spine, that the house felt sick somehow, as though it had caught an illness no physician could name. By the time the first rooster crowed, every member of the Harrow household was awake, listening to the scraping groans of their aged home, knowing with an unspoken certainty that ordinary mornings did not begin like this. And outside, beyond their bolted door, London began to sweat. Dawn crept into the city not with light but with a smouldering, breathless weight that settled into every chamber like an unwanted guest. In a modest house near Bishopsgate, where the walls leaned inward as if listening, the first true sign of the coming terror made itself known. It did not scream. It did not warn. It arrived quietly on a bed of rumpled linen, in the shallow breaths of a young apprentice who woke drowning in heat that did not belong to him. Matthew Turner was 16, slight of frame, quick with his hands and quicker with worry. He was used to the sleeplessness of work of nights spent sewing torn waistcoats, repairing cuffs, threading needles by candlelight until his eyes burned. But this was different. This was wrong. He woke with a gasp that scraped his throat raw, his body slicked with sweat as though he'd run from one end of London to the other. He sat up, shivering in the strange heat, his breath fogging faintly as if the air coldly rejected what poured from him. The sheets clung to his back, his hair was plastered to his forehead, his skin was dry and burning at once, a contradiction that made his fingers tremble when he reached up to wipe his brow. The room around him felt close, warped by the thickness of the morning. The candle he'd left half melted the night before had collapsed in the heat, the wax pooling on the table like spilled marrow. A fly buzzed weakly near the window, its wings dragging through the air as though caught in invisible syrup. Matthew's gaze followed its sluggish orbit until it dropped suddenly onto the sill, motionless. He swallowed hard. Something was wrong with the world. Below him, the shop creaked awake. His master coughed once, harsh, sudden, a bark swallowed too quickly. Matthew winced. The sound felt unnatural in the air, distorted by the oppressive warmth. He swung his legs over the side of the mattress, the wooden floor warm beneath his feet. Sweat trickled down his temple again. Panic tightened his chest. He stripped off his damp nightshirt and reached for the basin by the window. The water, left out overnight, should have been cool. Instead, when he dipped his fingers in, it burned. Matthew jerked back as though struck. The bowl wobbled and nearly tipped. He stared at his reflection in the warped metal rim pail, eyes too bright, hair clinging to his skin, and felt a pulse of fear he could not name. The heat wasn't just around him, it was inside him. He tried to breathe steadily, but each breath came faster, shallower, as if some unseen hand pressed against his lungs. When he touched his chest, he felt his heart racing, far too fast for morning. A tremor ran through him. He told himself it was exhaustion, nothing more. The night had been long, the air heavy, everyone was waking strangely today. Perhaps he had simply overslept, trapped in a fever dream that would fade once he washed and dressed. But when he tried to rise fully, his legs buckled beneath him. He caught himself on the edge of the table, his fingers leaving wet streaks on the wood. Below, the shop door groaned open. A customer? At this hour? No. No footsteps followed. Just the soft, eerie sound of the street breathing in the unusual heat. Matthew forced himself toward the window. The glass was slick with condensation, though the outside air shimmered with a heat like forge fire. He wiped a small circle clear. The street beyond lay empty, still, watching. A bead of sweat slid down his spine in a cold line that made him shudder. He pressed a hand to the window frame to steady himself and realized the wood was warm, not sun-warmed, fever-warm. Somewhere far down the street, a bell began to ring. One clear toll, then another, slow, heavy, as if marking the first death of the day. Matthew leaned his forehead against the glass, breath fogging the pain. He did not yet know the name of the thing curling inside him, coiling through his veins like smoke. But London knew. London had felt it before. And the sweat on his sheets was only the beginning. The morning bell should have been crisp, sharp enough to cut through fog, loud enough to rattle shutters along the narrow lanes of Cornhill. Instead, it drifted over the rooftops in a muffled, faltering note, as though wrapped in cotton. Several citizens paused at their doorsteps, confused, waiting for the familiar rhythm that marked the day's beginning. But the second toll came late, its echo swallowed by the strange, swollen air that hung over London like a damp shroud. At the centre of the disturbance stood the town crier, Gregory Flint, a broad-shouldered man known for a voice that could drown the clamour of any market. He had risen before dawn, as always, lacing his boots and donning his heavy wool coat, despite the oppressive heat. Duty, after all, respected no season. But even he had hesitated before stepping into the street, unsettled by the weight of the morning. The air felt thick, metallic on his tongue. His breath dragged. Still, he forced himself onward, bell in hand. The city depended on his morning call. Court notices, trade warnings, stolen goods, new decrees. Gregory announced them all, beating back the silence that so often threatened to swallow the poorer wards of London. But today, the silence seemed to push back. He reached the usual crossroads, lifted his bell, and swung. The first clang wavered. Gregory blinked, heat prickling behind his eyes. Sweat rolled down his temples before the motion of his arm had even stopped. The second swing felt heavier, as though someone pressed a hand against his wrist. Yet he forced it upward again, refusing to shame himself in the square where he had shouted above storms and riots. But the third toll never came. His fingers loosened. The bell slipped from his grasp and clattered across the cobblestones, its hollow ring echoing strangely through the street. A few merchants peered from half-opened shutters. "Gregory?" someone called. The crier opened his mouth to answer, but no sound emerged, only a sharp gasp as his throat tightened. His body swayed. The world around him rippled, the buildings bending subtly as if the air between them twisted. He pressed a hand to his chest. His heart hammered faster than his breath, fast enough to hurt. He stumbled forward, catching himself against the well's stone rim. His palms slipped on the moisture there, not dew, he realized, but sweat, his sweat. It poured down his arm in rivulets. His vision blurred, the ground tilting beneath him in slow, nauseating waves. The onlookers hesitated, uncertain. Sickness, in a city as crowded as London, was an enemy no one rushed toward. "Are you drunk?" a baker called from a doorway. Gregory tried to shake his head, but the motion sent a jagged spike of pain through his skull. His knees buckled. A child crept closer, clutching a basket of bread. "Mister, do you need—" Gregory collapsed before the boy could finish. His body struck the cobblestones hard, folding as though the strings holding him upright had been cut. His breath rattled once, twice. The boy dropped the basket and ran. Within moments, shutters slammed, bolts slid, and the narrow street became a corridor of eyes, peering from cracks, watching but unwilling to step forward. Gregory lay alone in the square he had commanded for years, the bell resting only inches from his outstretched hand. The sweat spread across the stones beneath him in a widening pool, glistening in the harsh red light of the rising sun. Across the city, other bells faltered, other voices broke mid-call. London itself seemed to stumble, losing its balance as some unseen force swept through its streets, trailing heat and fear. Gregory Flint, the man who had woken a district every morning, lay motionless, as the city he served awakened to a truth it had desperately hoped never to see again. The sweat had returned, and it had chosen its first herald. By mid-morning, the city wore the heat like a fevered cloak. It draped over rooftops, pooled in the alleys, seeped beneath wooden thresholds with slow, deliberate persistence. And in house after house, grand, modest, and crumbling alike, Londoners barricaded themselves inside, clinging to the illusion that solid walls could keep sickness at bay. In a tall, narrow home off Milk Street, Mistress Eleanor Bray slid the final iron bolt into place. Her hands trembled, though her expression betrayed only stern resolve. She had awakened before dawn to the sound of distant bells and a heaviness in the air that whispered of things long buried in Tudor memory. When the neighbours began calling across the lane about a fallen crier, she wasted no time. Doors shut, windows latched, curtains drawn. Protection through isolation, this was all the city could manage. The house exhaled around her, beams groaning with trapped heat. Eleanor moved through the hall, feeling the oppressive air wrap around. her ankles like creeping fog, though there was no fog at all, just the unnatural warmth that blanketed every surface. Even the tapestries on the walls sagged, their woven threads heavy with moisture. Her husband, Edmund, paced the dining room, brow glistening under the flickering candlelight. "Do you think it's plague?" he asked, without looking up. She did not answer immediately. Plague had its own signature scent, death souring the air, bodies failing slowly. This felt like something different, something fiercer and invisible, a breath in the dark, a hand laid on one's spine before the mind could register it. "It isn't plague," she whispered at last, but her tone held no comfort, only fear. Upstairs, their two daughters sat near the window, staring at the street through a small gap where the curtain failed to fully meet the sill. They were supposed to avoid the outdoors at all costs, but children always found ways to spy on danger. Their eyes widened at the sight. Not chaos, not crowds, but a strange and disquieting stillness. A cart sat abandoned mid-street, its wheels still angled from a hurried stop. Laundry lines fluttered weakly, though there was no breeze to stir them. A dog scratched at a door across the lane, whining, ears flat. Sophia, the eldest, whispered, "Why won't anyone come out?" Her younger sister Clara hugged her knees. "Because something is out there," she murmured. Neither girl understood what that something was, but they felt it. Children sense dread with a clarity adults often bury beneath reason. From below came the scrape of a chair. Edmund had finally collapsed into a seat, elbows on the table, hands covering his face. The room around him shimmered with heat. The candles, though recently lit, melted too quickly, their wax forming long, hasty rivulets down the sides. Eleanor joined him, placing a cool cloth cooled only slightly in a basin of tepid water against his neck. "It will pass," she offered, though she did not believe it. "How can you know?" he asked, lifting his head. His eyes looked unfocused, rimmed with fear. "I've never felt the house like this. It's breathing." She knew what he meant. Every wall seemed to expand and contract with the temperature, every floorboard humming faintly as though the heat carried its own voice. The house felt alive in the most unnatural way. Then came a sound that silenced them both, the sharp clatter of something knocking against the door. Once, twice, a frantic rattling that echoed through the hall. Eleanor shot to her feet, dragging Edmund up with her until they stood frozen, listening. A voice cried from outside, hoarse, ragged, desperate. "Please, please let me in." Clara whimpered upstairs. Sophia clamped a hand over her sister's mouth to keep her quiet. Eleanor edged toward the door but stopped short of touching it. "Who's there?" A long pause, then a gasp. I don't know what's happening. It's so hot. I can't. Please." The voice dissolved into coughing, violent, racking, hollow. Eleanor pressed her fist to her lips. Edmund stepped closer, but she grabbed his wrist to stop him. Neither spoke what they both understood. Opening the door was a death sentence. The coughing outside grew weaker, then ceased entirely. Minutes passed. No footsteps, no breath, only the oppressive silence of the heat, pressing in from every direction. Eleanor backed away slowly, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Edmund swallowed hard, his face ashen. In the quiet that followed, the house grew hotter, still sweating, groaning, pulsing like a creature alive with dread. And behind every closed door in London, families pressed their backs against the wood, praying their fear would hold the hinges shut. The sweat had arrived, and it wanted more than the streets. By midday, the heat had thickened into something nearly tactile, a living, breathing heaviness that clung to the skin like damp wool. It circled through London's narrow arteries, slipping into shop fronts, coiling beneath beds, settling in the hollows of stairwells where light rarely touched, and in the uneasy gloom of St. Bartholomew's infirmary, the city's physicians, gathered by habit, by duty, and by a growing, unspoken terror. The infirmary's great hall usually smelled of vinegar, dried herbs, and the earthy musk of straw pallets. Today, those familiar scents were smothered beneath something more ominous, the metallic tang of fever sweat. It seeped from the pores of men and women who'd arrived at dawn with trembling hands, blurred eyes, and hearts beating far too fast for the hour. Physician Thomas Daring stood at the center of it all, stiff-backed and pale beneath his physician's cap. He was a tall man, normally controlled in word and gesture, but the morning's stream of patients had scraped the calm from him. Around him, apprentices hurried with basins and cloths, their faces shining with their own nervous perspiration. Another, an assistant, whispered, guiding a slumped woman onto a straw pallet. Her breath rattled like pebbles in a jar. She grew hot within an hour, the assistant added. Her family said she was mending clothes when she suddenly began to drip as if she'd run a mile. Thomas leaned in, his fingers hovering, not touching. The woman's hair was soaked, sticking to her cheeks. Beads of sweat trickled down her neck in steady streams. Her eyes flickered open, glassy, unfocused. He stepped back. Not plague, not ague, not fever, as he understood it. This was too sudden, too fierce, too swift, too merciless. A sickness that didn't creep so much as strike. From the far side of the hall, a voice rose, strained and trembling. Physician Margaret Hale, younger than most and sharp-minded, stood over a man who convulsed beneath her hands. "He's burning from the inside," she murmured. "His skin is cold, but feel his chest." Another physician reached out, then recoiled. "It's like touching a forge." A hush rippled through the room. Two priests entered quietly, their black robes dragging across the rushes. They came not to bless the sick, but to bless the dying. Already, the day had barely begun. Thomas turned toward the windows, hoping for a breeze, some sign the world beyond remained sane. Instead, he saw only the wavering haze of heat rising from the courtyard stones. A dog lay collapsed in the shade of a wall, sides heaving. No birds stirred, no carts rolled by. Even the distant bells had fallen strangely silent. Physician Daring, an apprentice, called from the doorway. Thomas hurried over and froze. 6 people huddled outside, swaying, clutching their chests, their clothes soaked through. Behind them, more approached in staggering lines, drawn toward the infirmary not by hope but by desperation. Some leaned on companions, some walked alone, some were carried. All were drenched in the same terrifying sheen of sweat. The apprentice whispered, "It's spreading faster than we can treat." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "We have no treatment," he said quietly. "Only time." And time was no ally. Inside the hall, a woman screamed one long, shuddering cry before collapsing into eerie stillness. A physician knelt beside her, pressing fingers to her wrist. He shook his head. Margaret Hale straightened from her patient, wiping her brow. "This has the signature of the old stories," she whispered to Thomas. "The ones our mentors dismissed as superstition." He knew the stories, the forgotten affliction, the sweat. But stories were not meant to breathe again. The hall grew hotter. Basin water turned tepid within minutes. Linen cloths dried too quickly, stiffening like parchment from the fever's intensity. Patients trembled until they could tremble no more. For the first time in many years, Thomas felt something he had never allowed: helplessness. "We can do nothing," he murmured. Margaret's voice broke. "Then we must watch." The city had brought its dying to their doorstep, and all the physicians of London trained in herbs, humours, stars and salves stood before a force that answered to none of them. Outside, the line of the afflicted lengthened as the afternoon sun climbed higher, turning the air into something molten. The sweat had returned, and the healers of London were powerless to stop it. By the time the church bells marked the 9th hour, the markets of London, normally loud enough to rattle the very fog, had fallen into a silence so unnatural it seemed carved from stone. Stalls that should have burst with noise and barter stood deserted, their awnings sagging beneath the weight of the heat. The city's great arteries, Cheapside, Smithfield, Billingsgate, throbbed faintly with the memory of commerce, But no footsteps answered the pulse. The market vendors had risen before dawn, as they always did. They lit ovens, sharpened knives, and arranged fruit and fish and cloth in neat rows. But one by one, as the heat pressed down with a suffocating ferocity, they faltered. A butcher felt his knees give way beside a table of mutton. A woman selling ribbons dropped her wares and clutched her chest, sweat pouring from her like water from a broken barrel. A fishmonger watched his catch spoil before the sun had fully risen, scales turning soft, the river's chill, evaporating into the oppressive air. And then, almost wordlessly, they fled. At first, a few simply stepped away to splash their faces, to catch some breath of wind that never came. But soon whole rows of stalls emptied in quiet, fearful retreat. Merchants abandoned coin boxes, knives, bolts of cloth, bundles of herbs, every tool of their trade left behind like offerings to a god none wished to name. Now, as the hour passed, the market stood in eerie stillness. A single cart lay overturned near the center of Cheapside, its wheels still gently spinning from where its owner had toppled it in his haste to escape. Bright red apples rolled across the stones, collecting in the dips of the street like scattered marbles. The fruit glistened with moisture, not dew, but a sheen of the same heat that gripped every corner of the city. Above the empty stalls, pennants hung limp, their edges curling from the warmth. A jug of milk left out for sampling had separated, the cream rising thick and sluggish. Bread that had been fresh mere hours earlier now emitted a faint sourness. The air smelled wrong, of rot beginning too soon, of heat accelerating decay, of something foul awakened by the fever spreading through the city. A lone figure moved tentatively between the stalls. Mistress Braithwaite, a widowed cloth merchant, clutched her shawl around her, though the heat pressed through the fabric like a burning hand. She had come searching for her youngest son, who should have been sweeping the market lanes at this hour. But each step she took echoed in the vast emptiness, swallowed by the oppressive air. She paused near a row of spice merchants, her breath catching. A man slumped against a sack of peppercorns met her gaze, his eyes glassy, unfocused. His chest rose and fell too quickly. Sweat dripped from his brow onto the spilled grains, darkening them. "I just grew hot," he whispered, voice cracking. Hot, all at once. She backed away, one hand pressed over her mouth. Not plague, she thought. Plague does not strike like lightning. From the far end of the square came the hollow sound of hoofbeats, but when she turned, she saw no horses, only a constable staggering past, leaning heavily on the wall of a shuttered bakery. His face glistened with unnatural sweat. He lifted a trembling hand as if to greet her, then thought better of it and moved on, dragging himself toward the infirmary. The bell in the old clock tower rang out, but the sound seemed muddied, weighed down. Mistress Braithwaite shuddered at its echo. Bells were beginning to toll at odd intervals across the city, never together, never long, always sudden, as though marking each fresh collapse. As she hurried toward the lane, her shawl clutched tight, she glanced back one last time. A warm breeze stirred the fabric of the abandoned stalls, making them flutter weakly like lungs straining for breath. London had always been loud in its suffering. Fires roared, plagues wailed, riots clashed. But this new horror crept in silence. It sickened in silence. It killed in silence. And the markets, once the beating heart of the city, now stood as their own grim omen, empty, breathless, and waiting for what the heat would bring next. The sweat had claimed the streets. Soon, it would claim the kingdom. By noon, London no longer felt like a city, but a living organism, vast, shuddering, and running a fever that the sky itself seemed powerless to cool. The heat pressed downward with suffocating insistence, pooling in alleys, hovering beneath the wooden eaves of houses, sinking into the very stones of the streets. And beneath that oppressive weight, the city developed a rhythm, uneven, unsettling, a pulsation of dread that reached into every chamber and courtyard. It began subtly, the kind of shift only those accustomed to the city's heartbeat could detect, a sudden stillness where noise should have swelled, a faint tremor in the air, as though something massive stirred beneath the surface. The Thames, usually heaving with river trade, lay strangely calm, its surface glass smooth except for irregular ripples that formed without wind or passing boat, spreading outward like the slow exhale of a sleeping giant. Across London Bridge, where carts and pedestrians should have jostled, shoulder to shoulder, a thin trickle of movement replaced the usual crush. Travellers paused mid-step, palms pressed against the railing as they peered into the river below. Some whispered prayers, others simply stared, waiting for the city to reveal the source of its strange pulse. On Dowgate Hill, a scholar named Benedict Varney looked up from his window, quill suspended in mid-air. He had been writing a treatise on Roman architecture, an ordinary task for an ordinary day. But the moment the city's rhythm shifted, something inside him stirred. He crossed the room to the window, pushing it open to the heavy air. A sound, low and steady, vibrated faintly beneath the cobblestones. Not a roar, not a tremor, more like a heartbeat. A pulse impossible to locate. It seemed to throb in the very foundation of the city, as though London had become a creature in its own right, its blood rushing feverishly through hidden veins. Benedict pressed his hand to the stone wall beside the window. The surface was warm, unnervingly warm, and when he closed his eyes, he swore he felt the faintest quiver beneath his palm. Not possible, he told himself. Walls do not breathe. Cities do not pulse. But the sensation persisted. He backed away slowly, his heart pounding in a rhythm that did not match the one he felt in the city's bones. A scholar's mind favored logic, but logic had begun to dissolve under the weight of whatever had taken hold of London. Across the lane, a horse stamped nervously, its breath quickening. Its owner tried to calm it, but the animal resisted, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring. Beneath its hooves, the ground pulsed again softly, subtly yet enough to send the creature rearing. It broke free, galloping down the street until it vanished into the thick, shimmering haze. The owner stared after it, trembling. "It's the heat," he murmured to no one. "Only the heat." But the words rang hollow. Even the insects sensed it. Flies formed erratic, buzzing swarms around doorways, then scattered as though fleeing some unseen predator. Dogs lay motionless in the shade, ears twitching with each faint throb from beneath the earth. Cats slunk low to the ground, muscles taut, eyes wide. Inside St. Giles' Cripplegate, the priest paused mid-sermon. The church lay dim, candles guttering in the thick air. The congregation shifted uneasily on their benches, listening not to him, but to the strange, deep rhythm echoing through the walls. A murmur passed through the crowd as they clutched rosaries and handkerchiefs. "It's nothing," the priest assured them, though sweat trickled down his temples. "The Lord tests us with heat, nothing more." But even he did not finish the sermon, because the pulse was growing stronger, not loud but inescapable, a steady beat threading through the streets, rising and falling, like the breathing of something enormous, or the trembling of countless hearts beating too fast, or the collective dread of a city on the brink. As the day wore on, the rhythm took on a pattern. With each distant scream, it quickened. With each collapse in the market squares, it tightened. With each door slammed shut, each window barred, the pulse deepened, echoing through London's bones. The city was not alive, of course, but it felt alive, and like any creature struck by fever, it braced for the worst. The sweat had not merely returned, it had synchronized with London itself, and London could feel it. By mid-afternoon, the oppressive heat had grown so thick it seemed to bend the very light that touched it. Shadows wavered like figures shifting behind a veil, and every alley breathed out the same soured, humid air, as though the city's lungs were failing. And through that distorted world ran a boy, barely 13, fleeing not from a person or a place, but from something far more intimate, the fire blooming within his own blood. His name was Elias Green, son of a cooper. Quick-footed, sharp-eyed, known throughout the parish for outrunning older boys in games he rarely understood but always won. Yet now his speed betrayed him. Each step jarred his bones, each breath scraped his throat, each heartbeat struck with the violence of a hammer blow. Sweat streamed down his back in rivulets, dripping from his chin onto the cobblestones as he tore through the lanes behind Pudding Lane. He had awakened an hour earlier to a sensation so unnatural it had torn him from sleep. Heat, pure, merciless heat gathering beneath his skin as though he had swallowed flame. He'd cried out for his mother, but the words tangled on his tongue. When she touched his forehead, her hand recoiled as though scalded. "Elias, oh God! Elias, stay still, we'll fetch help." But he couldn't stay still. The heat clawed at him, urging him to move, to flee, to escape his own burning body. Before she could stop him, he bolted through the door, stumbling into the blinding glare of the afternoon streets. Now he ran like a hunted creature, darting through the maze of timbered houses, as though distance alone could cool the inferno in his veins. His breath came in ragged gasps. The air tasted metallic, as if licked by lightning. His chest tightened. Each step grew heavier. His vision swam. A woman drawing water from a well saw him and froze. His face, normally flushed with youthful mischief, had taken on a ghastly pallor, framed by the unnatural shine of sweat pouring down his temples. "Boy?" she whispered, stepping back. "What's wrong with you?" Elias couldn't answer. His tongue felt thick. His lungs felt too small. He stumbled forward, and she backed away, dropping her bucket, water spilling across the sun-baked stones in a steaming plume. He reached the edge of the marketplace, now deserted, silent, too vast. The empty stalls watched him like hollow eyes. The heat intensified, pressing against him in waves, almost conspiratorial. His knees buckled. He caught himself on the wooden post of a butcher's stall, leaving a slick palm print behind. A tremor seized him. His heart thundered wildly, faster than any sprint could justify. He tried to breathe, but air refused him, sliding past his lips as though turned to stone. Panicked tears burned his eyes as he staggered toward a narrow yet familiar alley. Home was somewhere behind this row of shops, wasn't it? If he could only reach it, reach his mother, reach cool water, cool air. But the fever had no mercy. Halfway down the alley, his body betrayed him. His legs buckled, sending him sprawling to the ground. The cobblestones seared his skin where it touched them, or perhaps that was only him burning, burning, burning. He clawed weakly at the ground, dragging himself forward inches. Sweat pooled beneath him, soaking his shirt, dripping from his jaw in rhythmic taps that echoed faintly through the alley's silence. Somewhere nearby, a shutter creaked open. A pair of eyes wide, frightened, peeked down at him. Elias lifted a trembling hand, fingers curling toward the window. "Help! Me!" he rasped, though the plea was barely a breath. The shutter slammed shut. A moment later, another shutter, then a door, then another. The sound of bolts sliding home traveled through the alley like falling dominoes, one after another, swift, final. London swallowed its fear behind wood and iron. Elias pressed his forehead to the stones. A sob shuddered through him, but even that felt weak, drowned by the fever's raging tide. His heartbeat, once strong and defiant, now palpitated with frantic, failing rhythm. Too fast, too thin, too hollow. Above him, the sky shimmered, bending in unnatural waves. The boy who could outrun anyone had finally found a foe he could not escape. By the time a constable discovered him an hour later, after working up the courage to patrol the silent streets, Elias's body lay still, heat still radiating faintly from his skin, sweat still glistening beneath the unkind sun. The boy who ran from his fever had become one more silent warning, and London, terrified, kept its shutters closed. By late afternoon, the city's bells, those ancient iron throats meant to measure time, call worshippers, and warn of danger, had become something else entirely. They rang not in harmony or order, but in scattered, uneven bursts, as though each church tower felt its own private terror and voiced it without waiting for the others. The sound drifted over London in trembling waves, rising and falling, echoing across the rooftops like the city's ragged breathing. Saint Mary Le Bow tolled first one heavy note that groaned through the hot air like a dying beast. It should have been followed by a measured sequence. Instead, a pause. A second bell rang too soon. Then another, striking off tempo. A fourth came sharp and frantic, the clapper hitting with such force it seemed to bruise the metal itself. Near the churchyard, a group of residents stood frozen in the street, heads tilted upward. They looked as though they expected to see smoke pouring from the belfry, or angels descending, or perhaps the building bending with the fever that had overtaken the city. But there was nothing to see, only the sound, tortured, irregular, persistent. A man whispered to his wife, "Someone's ringing the death bell." "For whom?" she asked, voice breaking. He shook his head. "For too many." Across the river, Southwark's bells answered higher, thinner, shaking like frightened hands. Each toll shivered across the rooftops and sank into the heavy air, absorbed by the heat as though swallowed whole. No one had ordered the ringing. Priests had not sanctioned it. Sextons were collapsing at their posts. Yet the bells continued, struck by trembling hands or falling bodies, or perhaps by the tremors of the city itself. In a cramped courtyard off Bread Street, an elderly woman named Agnes Rawlins sat on her stoop, head bowed, rosary slipping through her damp fingers. She counted each toll, lips trembling in silent prayer. When she reached the end of the beads, she began again. A cat wound itself around her ankles, restless, whining. Agnes barely felt its fur against her bare feet. The heat had numbed her senses until everything felt distant. "It's the sound of a city dying," she whispered to no one. Inside a nearby house, a man named Richard Hensley clamped his hands over his ears. The bells reverberated through the walls, making them tremble faintly. Sweat soaked his tunic, plastering it to his body. His infant daughter lay in a cradle beside him, face flushed, chest heaving with shallow breaths. He rocked her desperately, begging the bells to stop, as though silence alone might cool her fever. But the bells did not stop. They tolled again and again, discordant and unrelenting. At St. Dunstan in the east, the bell rope slipped from a sexton's hand as he doubled over, sweat pouring from him. But the bell above continued to sway, nudged by some invisible force, the wind that wasn't wind, the tremor that wasn't tremor, the fevered pulse of the Dar, city that had grown stronger with every collapsed body. The bells became the soundtrack of the outbreak, a sound that twisted the air, a sound that no Londoner could escape. At the docks, sailors refused to disembark, crossing themselves as they listened to the uneven tolling drifting over the river. Some claimed the bells were calling the dead. Others insisted they were warning the living. A few muttered that the sound matched the beating of their own frantic hearts. But the truth lay somewhere deeper, somewhere darker. The bells rang because the city could not scream, and as dusk pressed its long shadow across London, the bells took on a desperate, warbling rhythm, faster, louder, almost panicked, mirroring the racing heartbeats of the afflicted. Agnes Rawlins raised her head at last, eyes glassy with fear. "Hush," she whispered toward the distant towers. "Hush before you call it closer." But the bells would not hush. They tolled into the suffocating twilight, speaking for the dying and warning the living, until even the healthiest Londoners felt their pulses quicken in dreadful imitation. And within that, ringing those uneven, gasping tolls, London understood. The sweat was no longer creeping. It had arrived. Long before the sun rose on the second day of the sweat, London's wealthiest merchants had already begun their exodus. They slipped away in the dim, reddish haze of dawn, not in wagons or grand litters, but on foot, cloaked and hunched, as though fleeing a crime rather than a plague. Their departure was quiet, furtive, and unannounced. They left behind ledgers still open on counting tables, coins sorted into careful stacks, bolts of silk unfurled across workbenches. Profit had always been their heartbeat, but this heat, this invisible threat, silenced even greed. In the narrow streets around Lombard Street, the first sign of their disappearance was the sound of keys turning not to lock up, but to abandon. A goldsmith named Lionel Yarcombe stood at his workshop door, sweat trickling from his brow. His apprentice watched him from the shadows, holding a sack of tools. "We'll be back in a few days," Lionel muttered, though he avoided the boy's eyes. The air will clear, but the shop's interior told another story. Papers lay scattered. The safe hung open, its contents hastily stuffed into the pockets of Lionel's heavy coat. A half-finished necklace glimmered weakly on the table, its pearls beading with moisture under the strange heat. The apprentice swallowed. "Should I come?" "No," Lionel snapped, then softened as he wiped his glistening forehead with trembling fingers. "Stay. Watch the shop." But the boy could see it. Lionel wasn't coming back. None of them were. The merchants had smelled danger before anyone else sensed it in the thickening air. The unnatural hush of the markets, the frantic tolling of bells. They trusted their instincts more than their physicians, and their instincts told them survival required distance. Already, shapes moved in the dim road, figures wrapped in cloaks despite the heat, slipping between shadows, clutching bags stuffed with coin. They moved in clusters, avoiding the main thoroughfares where the poor had begun to gather, coughing, sweating, trembling. At the corner of Cornhill, Master Peregrine Bellwood rushed from his brick house, dragging his wife behind him. Their 2 sons trailed close, each carrying a bundle. They walked fast, too fast for dignity, and Peregrine flinched each time he heard the cough of a stranger. "Do not stop," he hissed at his family. "Do not speak to anyone." But the city noticed their flight. A washerwoman, pale and exhausted from tending to her sick husband, saw them rush past and called weakly, "Where are you going?" "Where?" Peregrine did not answer. Instead, he quickened his pace. From behind shuttered windows, unseen eyes watched the wealthy flee. This was not the noble exodus of a court relocating for summer or a procession leaving after a festival. This was fear, raw, naked fear, and fear always leaves traces. On the doorstep of a spice merchant's home, fresh footprints marked the dust. A cloak snagged on a nail fluttered like a ghostly flag. A dog sniffed at a spilled purse containing only worthless notes, its silver coin long ago lifted by a desperate owner. As the sky brightened to a harsh, unforgiving white, the exodus swelled. Merchants streamed toward the city gates, Aldgate, Bishopsgate, Newgate, hoping to outrun the fevered air that seemed to chase their heels. Gatekeepers, sweating beneath their helmets, shouted for order. "No one leaves without cause. State your business." But the wealthy did not slow. Coin clinked into guard hands. Signatures were scribbled. Names given falsely. Stories fabricated. "My sister is dying in the countryside. My wife is ill and must see a healer outside the walls. We travel for business, urgent business. Urgent indeed. Urgent as breath. Past the gates, the roads filled with their retreat like ants fleeing a burning nest. Carriages groaned beneath hastily packed chests. Servants struggled under burdens too heavy. Children cried in confusion, tugging at the sleeves of feverish parents. And London, abandoned and sweltering, watched them go. Inside the city walls, the heat grew thicker, more insistent, wrapping itself around the empty shops like a slow constriction. The abandoned merchant houses creaked in the rising temperature, shutters swelling, iron locks bending slightly under the strain. All that was left were the poor, the sick, and the ones who could not run fast enough. The sweat did not care for coin. It did not chase horses. It did not respect social rank. But it watched, it waited, and as the last merchant slipped through the gates, the city felt the shift and inhale, a tightening. London was being left to burn, and the fever, patient but hungry, was only beginning to feed. By late afternoon, when the sun hung over the city like a molten coin, whispers began to seep through London's sweltering streets, whispers that rose from servants' corridors, market stalls, and shuttered alahouses alike. The court knows. The king knows. Even Henry cannot ignore the heat. For in the maze of palace corridors at Bridewell, where courtiers usually glided like bright birds from chamber to chamber. The air had grown stagnant and thick. Silk tapestries drooped on their hooks. Candles refused to hold their shape. The marble floors radiated warmth as though the palace itself were baking from within. And the King Henry VIII, broad-shouldered, golden-bearded, and accustomed to command, found his authority strained by something he could neither see nor strike. He had risen before dawn, sweating despite the chill that should have lingered in the stone walls. His servants had brought bowls of cool water, but even the basins steamed by the time they reached the royal bedchamber. At first, Henry blamed the heat on the weather, on faulty ventilation, on the clumsy handling of the servants. But when a palace page collapsed at his feet, face pale, chest heaving with the same frantic breaths reported in the city, Henry felt the first coil of dread tighten in his gut. He sent for his council, then he sent them away, then he summoned them again. Fear made even kings inconsistent. Now, as he paced the northern gallery, his heavy boots striking sharp against the stone, he tried to ignore the trembling of the tapestries that lined the walls. They were not stirred by wind, there was no wind. They trembled with the deep, resonant pulse of the city beyond the palace walls. Heat, illness, sweat, words whispered like curses through the court. At the far end of the gallery, Cardinal Wolsey approached, robes dragging across the slick floor. His face glistened with perspiration, his breathing labored from even the short walk. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing slightly. "Reports are increasing. The city is—" "I know the city is frightened," Henry snapped, though his own voice wavered in the dense air. "It has endured before." Wolsey swallowed. "This is not plague, sire." Henry spun to face him, eyes blazing with something dangerously close to fear. "Then what is it?" Wolsey hesitated. In the pause, the palace seemed to lean closer, as though listening. "Some speak of the sweat," the cardinal whispered. "The affliction of your father's reign." Henry's jaw tightened. "That was decades ago. A ghost story." "Ghosts can return, Your Majesty." Henry opened his mouth to retort, but a distant sound reached them, carried faintly through the shuttered palace windows. Bells, tolling out of sequence, their notes warped by the heat. St. Bride, St. Martin, St. Margaret. Their uneven cadence drifted across the river, crawling along the palace walls like fingers scratching at the stone. The king stiffened. "Close every gate. Seal the gardens. No one enters the palace without my command." Wolsey bowed again, lower this time. "And the citizens, sire, they look to you." "The city expects, the city will wait," Henry growled. "Let the Lord Mayor manage his own streets. My concern is the crown." But even as he spoke the words, Henry's gaze drifted to the nearest window. Beyond the warped glass, the city sprawled, rooftops shimmering, chimneys swaying slightly in the fevered air. He could almost feel London's breath, shallow and labored, rising to reach him. In the courtyard below, courtiers had gathered in uneasy clusters, whispering behind gloved hands. One woman fainted atop the steps. 2 servants carried her away, both sweating profusely, though the effort was small. A falconer's boy, normally quick and spry, leaned against a column, chest heaving. Fear was becoming contagious. The king turned sharply away from the window, as though refusing the city's gaze. Behind him, the bells tolled again, closer, louder, trembling through the palace floors. Henry clenched his fists. He was a man used to flesh and blood enemies, to rebellions crushed and rivals silenced. But this moved like a shadow he could not strike. "Your Majesty," Wolsey said quietly, "the court cannot remain here. Not with the merchants fleeing, not with the physicians overwhelmed. We must withdraw to the countryside." Henry's silence was long and heavy. A king fleeing his capital would mean only one thing. Fear had replaced certainty. Panic had toppled power. But outside, in the feverish air that pressed upon London like a curse, the bells gave their answer. They did not stop. And Henry VIII, for the first time in his reign, felt smaller than the city he ruled. The sweat crept toward the palace, and the monarchy could cast no shadow long enough to keep it out. The heat inside the palace grew so thick and oppressive that even the high-born, swathed in silks and jewels, began to move like ghosts drifting through a fever dream. By early evening, Bridewell and its adjoining court buildings lay draped in a suffocating stillness, as though someone had cast a dark velvet cloak over every corridor, every chamber, every breath. Court life, normally a dazzling spectacle of color and noise, had dimmed into a procession of pale faces, hushed voices, and trembling hands. Even the musicians had abandoned their lutes and viols, the strings wilting in the stifling air. Servants stumbled through their duties with glazed eyes, sweating under the weight of fabrics meant for winter. The scent of lavender oil, usually dabbed on collars and gloves, clung sourly to the air, overwhelmed by the sharp tang of fear. In the Queen's corridor, where polished floors once reflected candlelight in shimmering pools, the wax had begun to warp and drip from the sconces, leaving waxy trails along the paneling. Ladies in waiting clustered near the windows, pressing lace kerchiefs to their mouths, as though the very air had soured. Their gowns clung damply to their backs, their hair curling against their necks. "Do you hear it?" Lady Anne Wentfield whispered, clutching her rosary with whitened knuckles. Another woman nodded, face pale. "The bells, they're wrong. They sound like they're crying," a third murmured. Beyond the courtyard walls, the bells were crying, wailing, gasping, faltering as though wrung by hands that shook with fever or bodies that collapsed mid-toll. The sound seeped into the palace like water through cracked stone, refusing to be kept out. And everywhere, eyes darted toward the king's chambers. Whispers spread like smoke in a closed room. Has His Majesty taken ill? Does he sweat? Does he tremble? Has the sweat reached the crown itself? Alone in her chamber, Queen Catherine of Aragon sat rigidly on a carved, wooden chair, her fingers twisted in silent prayer. The Spanish tapestries behind her depicted saints and martyrs, but tonight, even the woven faces seemed shadowed with dread. Her ladies knelt at her feet, whispering supplications under their breath. Catherine's voice was steady, but her hands shook. "We will not abandon the people," she said. "If the king retreats, he must not be seen to flee." But even as she spoke the words, her gaze drifted to the shuttered window, beyond which London writhed in the feverish glow of twilight. She knew what her council feared. A monarch who stayed risked becoming a martyr of the sweat, a symbol of divine judgment. A monarch who fled risked becoming a coward, abandoning his subjects to die alone. In a distant corridor, a palace physician hurried past with his cloak billowing like a black wing. Sweat gleamed on his brow. The satchel in his hand clattered with empty vials. He was called to tend to a diplomat from Calais, a man who had collapsed during supper, trembling violently, drenched in sweat that dripped from his sleeves and pooled on the mosaic tiles. 2 hours later, the diplomat was dead. The courtiers heard the news not through formal announcement, but through the sudden, frantic slamming of a door and the ragged sobbing of a servant. Rumors multiplied. "A Frenchman has died in the palace. The sweat is here. We are trapped." Fear swelled like a rising tide. Some tried to flee. Lord Talbot sprinted down a hallway, his heavy boots scattering servants, but he found the courtyard gate barred. Guards, sweating and trembling in their armor, refused to unlatch it. "Orders from the council," one muttered. "No one leaves without royal permission." Talbot struck the gate with his fist until his knuckles bled. In the end, he slid down the bars, sobbing, pressing his face against cool iron that gave him nothing in return. The palace had become a gilded cage. Elsewhere, the royal falconer discovered 2 of his birds dead in their mews, not from plague, not from wounds, but from sheer heat. Their wings lay splayed over the straw, feathers damp and curling at the edges. When he lifted one, its body was warm as coals. He knelt beside them, shuddering. Falcons were resilient creatures, bred to weather storms, winds, winter frost. If they succumbed to heat, then what of the people? As night fell, The palace grew darker, though candles still burned. Shadows lengthened, the air pressed down harder, the city's strange, fevered heartbeat reached up through the floorboards, through the stones, into the very bones of Bridewell. And over it all, the court huddled beneath its invisible cloak, waiting, listening, trembling, knowing that no rank, no title, no closeness to the king could keep the sweat from slipping beneath the door. The court had entered its long night, and the night had teeth. As twilight bled into night, the city began to close itself like a frightened creature curling inward. One house at a time, then whole streets, then entire parishes. London sealed its doors against the fevered world outside. Bolts slid into place. Iron latches clanged. Wooden beams were lowered across thresholds with the same solemnity as coffin lids. And behind each barrier, families sat in dim candlelight, straining to hear what moved in the streets they no longer dared to walk. In a cramped home off Fetter Lane, the Whitcomb family huddled in the main room. The father, Samuel, had dragged a heavy oak dresser across the front door, wedging it so violently that one of the legs snapped beneath the strain. His breaths came in short bursts, more from fear than exertion. His wife, Judith, sat close to the hearth with their 3 children pressed into her skirts. No fire burned there, the heat was too great, but old habit drew her to its familiar shadow. Not a sound. Samuel hissed, placing a trembling finger to his lips. If someone knocks, you hear nothing. If someone coughs, you answer nothing. Little Mary, only 5, pressed her face into her mother's gown. "Why can't we help them, Mama?" Judith's voice cracked. "Because we cannot help ourselves, child." Outside, the street lay bathed in an unnatural glow, as though the air itself emitted a dim red hue. The day's heat had not eased, it had merely settled, sinking low to the ground where it clung like a feverish fog. The cobblestones gleamed with moisture condensation from the air, sweat from bodies, tears of a city drowning in its own heat. A sudden knock shattered the stillness, 3 loud raps, then frantic pounding. Samuel froze. The children whimpered. Judith clutched Mary tighter. "Please!" cried a voice, thin, urgent, choked. "Please, for the love of God, let me in." Samuel shook his head fiercely, stepping back from the door as though it might burst open under the weight of the plea. The voice outside gasped, followed by the unmistakable sound of a body collapsing against the wood. A long, wet smear echoed as the figure slid down the door, then a choked, rattling breath. Judith covered her mouth, eyes brimming. "Don't open it," Samuel whispered hoarsely. "He's already gone." They waited. Minutes stretched. Then the voice ceased altogether. Farther down the lane, other households had bolted themselves behind makeshift barricades. Through narrow cracks in the shutters, faces peered out at shadows crossing the street. Not people, shadows. Sweat-slicked shapes staggering beneath the heat, searching for shelter, for mercy, for any door that might open. No doors opened. London's kindness had evaporated with the first wave of fever. Atop a nearby roof, a pair of cats hissed as a man stumbled into the center of the street. His shirt clung to him in sodden folds. His hair dripped as though he'd been dragged from a river. He staggered, arms outstretched, reaching for a lamppost that seemed to bend away from him. "Help," he rasped, then coughed, doubling over. Candle flames inside the surrounding houses flickered as though recoiling. Windows were shut so fast that the shutters struck their frames with sharp cracks. The man sank to his knees. "Please," his voice broke. Then he pitched forward into the heat-slicked dust and did not rise again. The cats watched in eerie stillness. Inside their sealed homes, Londoners listened, every thud, every groan, every dragging footstep amplified by the hollow quiet. The sweat thrived in that silence, seeping through the cracks of their fear. In one house, a mother clasped a crucifix so tightly it cut into her palm. In another, a man began to pray in a language he had not spoken since childhood. In yet another, a young bride stared at her wedding ring, wondering if she'd worn it long enough to be called a wife, before death came scratching at her door. As, Darkness deepened. The fevered glow outside cast red streaks across shuttered windows. The city appeared to throb, an immense heart beating slow and sickly beneath a suffocating sky. A faint scream rose somewhere in the distance, then another, then a series of panicked cries that ended abruptly, swallowed by the heat. But none of the bolted doors budged. London had become a labyrinth of sealed boxes, each containing its own trembling family, each praying the sweat would pass over them like a vengeful spirit, seeking other victims. And yet, behind those locked doors, the truth settled like dust. The sweat was already inside the city. Soon, it would be inside the houses. By the second evening, the physicians of London, those men who wrapped themselves in black robes and Latin words, who wielded herbs as armor and knowledge as blade, found themselves disarmed. Their tinctures, their powders, their poultices, their treasured apothecary secrets all lay powerless against the merciless heat that consumed the city. In the cramped back room of Master Harland's apothecary on Fleet Street, the air was so thick with the scent of boiling herbs that it stung the eyes. Glass bottles clogged the shelves, their wax seals sweating under the oppressive temperature. Copper pots bubbled over low flames, though the steam rising from them seemed sluggish, heavy, almost unwilling to drift upward. The very air felt fatigued. Physician Elias Harland wiped his brow with a cloth already soaked through. His hands trembled as he measured out another pinch of dried feverfew, dropping it into the pot in a desperate gesture. The mixture hissed weakly, as though resisting its task. It should cool them, he muttered under his breath. It should ease the sweating, but nothing eased anything. Every tincture turned bitter, every remedy soured, every concoction that would normally bring relief now clung to the air like a warning of its own futility. A knock rattled the back door sharp, frantic. Harland flinched. I said no more visitors, yet the knocking persisted, punctuated by a muffled plea. Doctor, please, I've coined my wife, she cannot breathe. Harland closed his eyes, jaw clenched. The cries of desperate families had become the rhythm of the day, pounding against locked doors like guilt made audible. And still, he had no cure. He had no answer. He had no weapon against the sweat. Still, he stepped toward the door. But before he reached it, an assistant, a young woman named Marjorie, grabbed his sleeve. Her face was pale and glistening, her hair stuck to her temples. Master Harland, you mustn't go out, she whispered. Look at them. They collapse in your doorway. They sweat themselves into death before your hands can touch them. We cannot treat what kills in an hour. Harland shook her off, though gently. We cannot abandon them either. A hollow sound echoed behind him, a cough that rattled like dry reeds. On a pallet near the hearth lay a young man, one of the earlier patients brought in before Harland barred the entrance. His shirt clung to him in soaked patches. Sweat dripped from his chin in rapid trails, pooling in the straw beneath him. Harland knelt beside the patient, placing trembling fingers on the man's wrist. The pulse thrashed wildly beneath the skin, too fast, too frantic. Bring the draught of willow and mint, Harland murmured. Marjorie fetched it at once. He lifted the man's head and pressed the bottle to his lips. The patient coughed again, a wet, violent hack, and the liquid spilled down his cheeks. His eyes rolled back, his limbs convulsed. Harland felt the heartbeat weaken beneath his fingertips. No, he breathed. No, stay with me. Another convulsion. Then stillness. Harland let the man's hand fall. His assistant pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. That's the fourth today. Harland stared down at his tinctures, the shelves lined with neat rows of vials, the years of study distilled into powders and liquids now useless. He felt something inside him fracture. Beyond the walls, the bells began tolling again, uneven, overlapping, resonant with misery. Marjorie's voice trembled. Master, what if this is not an imbalance of humors? What if this is something else? He turned toward her, eyes hollow. I do not know what this is, and the city expects an answer. The weight of that truth crushed the air around them. Harland rose slowly, moving back to the table of herbs. Feverfew, valerian, lavender. juniper, all worthless, their scents mingled in a sickly aroma that did nothing to cool the suffocating heat. His hands hovered above the mortar, then fell, limp, useless. "I have failed them," he whispered. "All of them." A sharp scream pierced the night from somewhere in the street beyond. Another collapse, another household mourning, another patient he could not save. Marjorie stepped forward, laying a trembling hand on his arm. "It is not your fault." But Harland knew better. A city had placed its hope in him and the others like him. They had opened their doors, extended their trembling hands, and begged for salvation. And the physicians of London, armed with learning, with tonics, with herbs, could only watch as the sweat tore through flesh and bone with a swiftness that mocked their craft. Outside, the heat pressed against the apothecary's walls like an unseen tide, threatening to seep inward. The tinctures had failed, the sweat had not, and the night, heavy and airless, promised worse to come. As the sun sank behind the crowded rooftops, and the London sky turned the colour of bruised plum, a suffocating heat still clung to every beam, every alley, and every breath of the city. The air did not cool with evening, on the contrary, it thickened, growing heavier, more oppressive, as though night sealed the fever in rather than releasing it. And in a cramped workshop off Goldsmiths' Row, a tailor named Josias Penn laboured beneath that crushing weight, fighting against the fatigue gathering in his limbs like lead. His shop was small but tidy, packed with bolts of wool and linen stacked neatly on high shelves. The scent of dye lingered in the air, normally a mild comfort, but now heavy and sharp, mixing with the hot, metallic tang that drifted through the city like an omen. Josias, a thin man with clever fingers and a stooped back from years of leaning over cloth, wiped the sweat from his brow and tried to steady his breath. The candle on his workbench had melted nearly to its base, its flame sputtering in protest against the suffocating air. But Josias worked on, urging the needle through a length of deep blue fabric commissioned by a merchant who, like so many others, had vanished from the city before dawn. He muttered to himself, voice trembling, "Just one more seam, then rest. Just one." But the seam refused to cooperate. His hands shook. The thread slipped from his fingers, again and again. Sweat dripped from his temples, falling onto the cloth and darkening the fabric in irregular patches. He stared at those wet marks, dazed, as if unable to comprehend that they came from him. A soft groan escaped his chest. He leaned back, pressing a hand to his sternum. His heart hammered too fast, too fiercely, like a frantic drum in a drowning man's ears. His breath stuttered. The air felt too thick to pull into his lungs. He blinked hard, but the workshop wavered, the wooden beams rippling at the edges of his vision. "Not now," he whispered. "Not me." From the adjoining room, his wife, Maribel, called to him. "Josias, are you still working? Supper is cooling." He tried to answer, but his voice caught on a dry gasp. He pushed away from the bench, rising unsteadily. The room warped as he did compressing, stretching its shadows, bending like dark cloth pulled taut. He stumbled forward, reaching for the doorframe. His fingers barely brushed the wood before his knees buckled. He fell to the floor with a sound so small it barely stirred the dust. Maribel heard it anyway. She rushed into the workshop, skirts rustling, hair already damp with the evening's unnatural heat. She found him collapsed beside the bench, his skin pale and glistening, eyes unfocused and wild with fear. "Josias," she cried, dropping to her knees. "My love, Josias. Look at me." His body convulsed as he tried to breathe. Sweat poured from him in torrents, soaking through his shirt, pooling on the wooden floor, glistening in the flickering candlelight. His heart lurched beneath her palm, fluttering, then racing, then fluttering again. Maribel raised her voice, frantic. "Help! Someone help us!" But the neighbors did not come. The heat outside pressed against their own doors, warning them back. They had bolted themselves in at sunset and would not risk a single crack of their shutters for anyone, not even for the tailor who had stitched their clothes for years. A door slammed shut somewhere down the lane. Another barred itself. Maribel sobbed, shaking him gently. Stay with me, please. Josias's trembling hand rose shakily, grasping at air until it found her sleeve. His eyes locked on hers for a brief, lucid moment, fearful, pleading, knowing. I feel it, he whispered. Inside, burning. His grip tightened once and then loosened. His chest shuddered. His breath stopped. The candle beside them guttered, flickered, and extinguished itself with a soft hiss. Maribel let out a sound that cracked the silence, a wail of grief so raw it almost broke against the heavy air. She folded over him, her tears mixing with the heat-borne sweat that soaked the floorboards. Outside, the street was empty, the buildings leaning into the night like mourners gathered around an unmarked grave. The air pulsed faintly, echoing the dying heartbeat that had just faded from the world. The sweat had claimed another, and London, bolted behind its doors, refused to hear her cry. As darkness settled across the city in a cloak of thick, feverish gloom, the grand houses of London, normally bastions of order, hierarchy, and rigid decorum, began to unravel from the bottom up. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly. A chambermaid slipping out a side door, a stable boy abandoning his post, a scullion fleeing the kitchens with only a crust of bread tucked under his arm. But soon the exodus rippled outward with the unstoppable momentum of panic. Servants ran. Everywhere, they ran. Not toward safety, there was none. Not toward hope, hope had withered by noon. They ran because standing still felt like lying down in a grave and pulling the soil over their own faces. In the mansion of Lord Hawksley on Bishopsgate Street, the servants' hall had always been a place of bustling life, pots clattering, gossip swirling, commands shouted by stewards with more patience for order than for kindness. But tonight, the hall lay abandoned, stew left cooling in the pot, spoons scattered on the table, a single lantern flickering weakly, as if protesting their absence. At first, Lord Hawksley noticed only the silence. A wealthy man notices quiet long before he notices the poor. He emerged from his dining chamber, calling for his steward. "Branwell? Branwell, where are you? The air has grown too close. Bring more candles." No answer. He tried again, irritation sharpening his tone. "Branwell." Only a faint scurrying sound responded, rats reclaiming territory. Long denied them. Annoyed, Lord Hawksley strode into the hallway, but the air pressed against him like a damp cloth held over his mouth. Sweat gathered beneath his collar. His heart thudded unpleasantly. Too warm, he thought. Far too warm. He descended to the servants' quarters. Empty. Beds unmade. Chests open. Belongings scattered as though their owners had fled in frantic haste. A single sheet of parchment lay on the table, held down by a pewter cup. In the wavering lantern light, the scribbled message revealed itself. "We beg your forgiveness, my lord. The sweat is in this house. We dare not stay." Hawksley staggered back, gripping the door frame. His wife had taken ill earlier that afternoon. Now he understood why the maids refused to enter her chamber. Fear had devoured loyalty. But his was not the only household fracturing. Across the city, the wealthy awoke to the same realization. Their homes had become carcasses, picked clean by the fleeing hands that once kept them alive. The grand manors of Cheapside, the stately residences of Aldermanbury, the merchant estates near the river, all stood hollowed out, echoing with the hiss of sweat hitting fever-hot floors and the feverish pulse of a city in ruin. At the home of Lady Greystoke, a footman sprinted across the courtyard, clutching nothing but the boots on his feet. "I'm not dying for a woman who's already half dead," he shouted over his shoulder, voice cracking. Behind him, another servant, a kitchen maid no older than 14, burst through the door, hair wild, eyes wide with terror. "Wait for me," she cried, chasing after him. The footman did not slow. At a wealthier estate near Temple Bar, two groundskeepers braced themselves against a locked gate, struggling to wrench it open. Inside the house, their master's voice bellowed from an upper window. "Cowards! Thieves! You will answer for this." But threats could not cool the fever seizing the city's heart, nor could it stop the servants from running. They fled into the night through alleys, through back gardens, through streets shimmering with unnatural heat. Their footsteps beat a frantic rhythm as they scattered across London like sparks blown from a dying fire. Some ran home to families who bolted their doors at the sight of them, afraid of the sweat glistening on their brows. Some ran toward the river, believing the Thames might cool the fire in their blood. Some ran until their legs gave out, collapsing on cobblestones still warm from the day's relentless sun. Some simply vanished into the dark, swallowed by the fevered maze of the city. And those who remained in the great houses, masters and mistresses accustomed to command, found themselves suddenly helpless. They wandered through dim corridors, calling out names with increasing desperation. "Thomas! Lydia! Samuel, where are you?" No voice answered. No footstep hurried to obey. No lantern appeared to light their way. The hierarchy of London had inverted itself in a single blistering night. The poor fled the rich. The powerful were abandoned. The servants saved themselves. And the city, stripped of its caretakers, began to rot from within. For in the silence left behind, the sweat moved more freely, slipping through empty halls, breathing beneath doorways, savoring the fear that now clung to the wealthiest homes like an unseen, spiraling fog. London's servants had run, and now nothing stood between the espart, fever, and the highborn. Night had deepened into a heavy, suffocating darkness when London finally noticed something it had never known before, not in plague years, not in famine years, not even in the great fires that sometimes licked the riverbanks. The Thames had gone quiet. Stillness, total and uncanny, had settled across its broad back like a burial shroud. No creak of mooring ropes, no splash of oars, no murmur of ferrymen calling across the water. The River London's ancient artery, its restless lifeline, lay motionless under the fevered sky, as though it had stopped breathing along with the city. At Billingsgate Dock, the air was thick enough to choke a man. The wooden planks radiated heat, warping slightly beneath the weight of it. Nets hung slack from their hooks, strands glistening with moisture that was not river spray but sweat, the sweat left behind by fishermen who had fled hours before. Their boats bobbed gently, untended, ropes tapping weakly against posts like impatient fingers. Only one man remained. Old Ralph Midwinter, who had lived more years on the river than on land, sat on an overturned crate near the edge of the dock. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, fixed on the black sheet of water, as though expecting it to speak. He felt the fever smouldering behind his ribs. He didn't need a physician to tell him what that meant. But the river, he'd always said the river knew things. The river warned. The river soothed. Tonight, it was silent. A whisper escaped him. "Why ain't you moving, old girl?" The Thames did not answer. Farther upstream, at Queen Hither, the same eerie quiet draped itself across the water. A small skiff drifted aimlessly near the bank, its oar dipping into the water at odd intervals, steered only by the faint tremor of Ralph's dying hands. But there were no ferrymen left to right it, no dock workers to call it in, no lantern-bearers moving along the wharf. For the first time in memory, the river had lost its watchers. In a tall house overlooking Southwark, a dyer named Alistair Crane opened his window to catch what little night breeze he hoped remained. Instead, the heat pressed against him like a wall. Below, the Thames stretched out unmoving, a long vein of stagnant black. Even the moon, bloated and red from the thick, feverish haze, refused to shine on its surface. His wife, Margaret, stood behind him, hand pressed to her chest. "Why is it so quiet?" Alistair shook his head slowly. "The river's wrong. That's not tide. That's not wind. That's nothing." He didn't finish the thought, because at that same moment, from far down the waterway, a faint sound echoed, soft, wet, and slow. A splash, one, then another. Something moved beneath the surface. Not fish, not oars, not the usual lapping tide. Something else, something heavy. Margaret backed away from the window. "Close it," "Alistair, close it now." But he did not move. His eyes widened as a shape, indistinct and diable, glistening, floated into view. It drifted past on the gentle current the river still managed, carried by the faint pull of water that refused entirely to die. A body, then a second, then three. Sweat, thick, oily, fever-born, shimmered across their limbs like a final, mocking sheen. Margaret made a sound between a gasp and a sob, clapping a trembling hand to her mouth. Dear God! Across the river, in the shadow of London Bridge, the same tableau unfolded, shapes drifting in the dark, silent as fallen leaves on a pond. A constable patrolling the bridge turned pale, gripping the railing as he stared down at the unmoving silhouettes. He whispered, "The river's taken them, but it ain't washing them clean." Somewhere in the blackness, the bells began again, distant, disjointed, tolling without pattern or hope. Their warped voices drifted over the water like the cries of lost souls. The river absorbed the sound. The river held it. The river did not move. Not truly. Not like a living river should. It had become a mirror of the city, heavy, sickened, breathless. Something ancient stirred in the constable's thoughts. Something told to him by his grandmother years ago. When the river stops, death walks faster. Tonight, death did not merely walk. It drifted, it watched, it waited, and the Thames, once the pulse of London, lay still beneath the fevered sky, as though bracing itself for the darkness yet to come. As night deepened and the fevered sky sagged over London like a swollen, burning lid, the people who had dared to venture into the streets earlier now fled toward their homes in desperate, stumbling waves. But the heat, unnatural, crawling, predatory, followed them. It slipped through alleys and clung to their backs like a living shadow. It did not relent. It did not scatter with the dusk. It crept with them, step for step, breath for breath, as though the sweat itself had grown eyes. The first to notice were the women returning from the communal wells. Carrying buckets that steamed in the night air, they hurried through twisting lanes, glancing behind them as though expecting to see someone or something giving chase. Their wooden pails sloshed with water that had turned warm, almost tepid. The buckets' metal hoops were hot to the touch. Every courtyard they passed seemed to exhale heat, as though the very bricks and timbers of the city had absorbed the fever and now radiated it back into the darkness. A young mother named Eleanor Marsh clutched her infant to her chest as she hurried across Cripplegate. Her steps were frantic, uneven. She had left her baby for only minutes to fetch water. But in that short time, the heat had thickened into something close to suffocation. She felt it pressing against her skin, slipping under her collar like fingers trying to find a place to grip. By the time she reached her doorway, her baby's tiny body was slick with sweat. "Please, not her," Eleanor whispered, voice trembling as she fumbled with the latch. "Not my sweet girl. Let me just get her inside." But inside offered no refuge. The air in her home was worse still, stagnant, hot enough to warp the grain of the wooden table. Her husband, Thomas, paced before the little hearth, sweat dripping from his temples. He had opened every window, but nothing stirred. No breeze, no relief. "She's hot," Eleanor gasped, pressing the infant against her husband's chest. "Tom, she's already hot." Thomas swallowed, eyes hollow. "The heat followed you," he whispered. "It's following everyone." Across the street, something slammed hard. A man stumbled into his home, collapsing against the door as he pushed it shut with his shoulder. His breath came in ragged gasps. Sweat poured from him as though his skin were a broken vessel. His wife screamed and backed away, clutching her rosary. "It chased me," the man rasped. "The heat, God save me! The heat chased me." Eleanor flinched, tightening her hold on her child. But it wasn't just the desperate telling stories. Something moved through the city. Something without shape, but with presence, felt more than seen. As Londoners fled, the heat surged behind them, rising in waves that rippled along the cobblestones. A butcher returning home from his abandoned stall wiped his brow and felt his hand come away wet, not from honest sweat, but from an oily sheen that shimmered faintly in the dying light. He wiped it on his apron. It returned instantly, sliding down his arms, his throat, his spine. He ran faster, but the heat grew faster still. By the time he reached his door, his heart hammered so violently he feared it might burst. He leaned against the frame, gasping. His wife opened the door with trembling hands. "What's happened?" she cried. He couldn't answer. His body slid downward, his legs buckled. She caught him with a sob, her dress soaking instantly with his fever sweat. From windows up and down the street, pale faces watched in terrified silence, because they, too, felt it. The heat did not just cling to the city, it clung to them. It followed, it pressed, it slipped under doors, through cracks, through seams in the wood. The moment a Londoner stepped inside, the heat followed like a loyal hound or a hungry one. Inside the home of the Whitcomb family, the air had grown so heavy it sagged like a physical weight. Samuel wiped sweat from his brow for the 20th time, gripping his wife's hand. "It's inside with us," he whispered. "We've sealed the doors, but the heat is inside." Judith nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Then how do we keep it out?" They both knew the answer. They couldn't. As night deepened, the heat thickened further, crawling into basements, rising through floorboards, pooling in attics, pressing its burning breath against the necks of children as they slept fitfully in their beds. London did not cool. London sweltered. London simmered like a cauldron sealed too tight, and the sweat, silent, sightless, insatiable, moved with it. The people of the city huddled in their homes, bolted their doors, whispered prayers into their trembling hands. But the heat kept following, and it would not stop. By the third morning of the sweat, the corridors of governance, once bustling with quills, arguments, and the rustle of parchment, fell silent. The city's ministers, aldermen, clerks, and council who guided London's machinery had retreated behind barred doors, locked shutters, and prayer-stained rooms as fear seeped into every crevice of civic authority. What remained were empty chambers swollen with heat, abandoned desks, inkpots dried to cracks, and a silence so thick it seemed to pulse like a second heartbeat. In the Guildhall, where civic leaders had gathered for generations to decide the fate of markets, roads, and trade, the great hall was deserted. The long oak table at its centre still held quills left mid-scratch, scrolls half unfurled, wax seals cooling atop unfinished decrees. The tall windows, normally flung open to let in the morning breeze, were shut tight. The stale air pressed downward like a heavy wool blanket soaked in boiling water. At the head of the empty table sat a pewter cup of watered wine, abandoned by Alderman Percival Roke mere minutes before he collapsed in his carriage on the way home the previous night. The servants had found him slumped over, drenched in sweat, eyes wide open as though he had glimpsed the fever itself reaching for him. At dawn, one clerk, young, earnest, loyal beyond reason, arrived at the Guildhall steps. His name was Stephen Maynor. He carried a ledger beneath his arm and a determined set to his jaw. "We cannot let the city go leaderless," he whispered to himself. "God help us, someone must keep the records." But when he reached the heavy doors, his hands froze. Pinned to the entrance was a scrap of parchment, flapping weakly in the stifling air. The ink had run from the heat, but the message was legible. "No assembly today. By order of the Lord Mayor. Return to your homes. Seal your doors. Trust no one." Stephen swallowed hard. His eyes darted up and down the street. No other clerks approached. No guards stood watch. No ministers paced the steps with impatient authority. Even the pigeons that normally flocked around the square were gone, leaving behind only feathers drifting like pale omens on the heated stones. He turned away, hands trembling, and hurried back toward his small lodging. The streets he passed were lined with shuttered houses. Once, he would have seen shopkeepers preparing their stalls, bakers carrying trays of steaming bread, merchants shouting about foreign cargoes. Now, nothing moved but the thick haze that distorted the edges of buildings. Within the Lord Mayor's residence, the situation was worse. Lord Mayor Edmund Harcourt sat alone in his study, drenched with sweat and gripping the arms of his chair. His powdered wig lay discarded on the floor, limp from heat and fear. His council chamber had been empty since sunrise. Not a single minister dared gather, not a single adviser answered his summons. Even his personal guards had abandoned their posts, leaving Harcourt to stare at the locked door with a growing sense of betrayal. A single physician had braved entry before dawn, a trembling man whose mask hung crooked over his mouth. He took one look at the mayor's flushed cheeks and trembling hands and whispered a single damning sentence. "Sir, if you feel heat behind your eyes, your time may already be short." Then he fled. Now Harcourt sat in the thickening gloom, listening to the distant bells tolling out of rhythm. Sweat pooled at the base of his neck. His breath rasped. He clutched his quill and forced himself to write, if not decrees, then a final message. We cannot meet. We cannot govern. London stands alone in the heat. But the ink smeared beneath his trembling fingers. Outside, across the city, lesser ministers made similar withdrawals. Some hid in wine cellars, others locked themselves in garrets. Some fled entirely, running for the countryside by torchlight, abandoning their posts without a word. Those who stayed were paralyzed, not by cowardice, but by the realization that the sweat moved faster than information, faster than decisions, faster than the machinery of government itself. By midday, London had no leaders left. No orders came. No proclamations were posted. No system remained to help the dying or count the dead. The city stuttered, halted, and then sank into a fevered quiet as the heat pressed harder, the bells tolled slower, and the river carried away more bodies than boats. The ministers had stopped meeting, and London, without its voice, began to drown in the silence. By the fourth morning of the sweat, London's fevered pulse had begun to radiate outward, creeping through the cobbled streets and into the surrounding shires like molten metal flowing into cold stone. By sunrise, the once busy roads leading to Essex were silent. Villagers who had risen early to tend to chores, fetch water, or carry messages had vanished into the fevered air. Only the echo of their passage remained, faint footprints in dust mixed with sweat, and the subtle shimmer of heat rising off the earth, bending the horizon like a mirage. A solitary cart sat abandoned on the edge of Chelmsford Lane. Its wheels sagged in the soft earth, the driver gone without so much as a shout. Inside, bundles of hay, a small crate of apples, and a sack of flour lay scattered, untouched. The air was heavy with the scent of spoiling bread and the iron tang of sweat, and the road itself seemed to pulse in rhythm with the distant, uneven tolling of church bells far down the highway. The rhythm felt alive, deliberate, a warning carried by the fever itself. Near the crossroads, an old woman shuffled forward, bent under the weight of her basket. Each step seemed an effort against the oppressive atmosphere. The heat pressed into her joints like a vice. Her skin glistened with early sweat, dampening her worn woolen gown. She paused at the edge of the lane, looking back toward the village she had fled. Smoke rose from chimneys, but the houses themselves seemed abandoned, dark hollows beneath sagging thatch. Not a soul moved. Not a single child laughed. Even the dogs had vanished into shuttered barns or remained hidden in the stables, ears flattened, bodies pressed low to the ground. The woman whispered a prayer under her breath, and it caught in her throat. She felt it before she saw it, a flicker, a movement along the road ahead. She squinted through the rising heat shimmer and saw the first signs. A boy, hunched and sweating, staggering under an invisible weight. His eyes were glassy, his cheeks flushed unnaturally. He moved in jerky, uncertain steps, and behind him the ghostly shape of the sweat followed, as if the very air were alive, curling around him, pressing against his back, nudging him forward. The old woman could not speak. She could not intervene. She could only watch as the boy swayed, stumbled, and fell. His hands scraped against the road, leaving dark streaks on the stone. The air seemed to hold him there for a long moment before releasing him, letting his body slump fully into the dust. She saw the sheen on his skin, the glisten of a death yet unrealized but imminent, and she shivered, clutching the basket tightly to her chest. Beyond the first mile of road, a second figure emerged, a merchant fleeing from Chelmsford Market. His cart had been abandoned hours earlier, his hands empty, eyes wide with panic. He ran with fever in his chest, sweat matting his hair, clothing clinging like a second skin. His breath rasped against the heat-thick air, and he did not see the shape that lingered just behind him, the invisible, patient presence that trailed each runaway with silent intent. By mid-morning, the road to London lay empty, but for these stragglers, few and fragile, torn between the instinct to flee and the realization that no sanctuary awaited them. Every house they passed stood shuttered, doors bolted, silence pressing back against them like a hand across their mouths. Even the animals sensed the sickness. Crows circled overhead, shrieking briefly before vanishing into the haze. Horses stamped in fear, hooves beating uneasily against the heat-warped cobblestones. The old woman turned back toward her village one last time. Smoke still curled from chimneys, but the sound of life was gone. Only the pulse of the empty road remained, shimmering and oppressive, carrying with it the promise that no road, no lane, no lane-side home could escape the heat that followed in the wake of the sweat. Essex slept under a fevered sun, and London's sickness had already begun to claim it. By the fifth morning, the great manors scattered across the Essex countryside had begun to resemble mausoleums more than homes. The timbered halls, once alive with the clatter of servants, the hum of conversation, and the rustle of fine cloth, now echoed only with the oppressive, suffocating weight of the heat. Doors that had been polished and well-oiled for generations were bolted from the inside, windows shuttered tight. The air within the manor houses hung heavy, oppressive, nearly liquid in its density, pressing against the walls, the ceilings, and the skin of those still alive. At Renford Manor, a sprawling estate long admired for its gardens and water features, the gates creaked on their hinges as the first pale light of dawn struggled through the mist. A carriage had waited at the threshold overnight, horses fidgeting and stamping on the cobblestones. Its driver had vanished before sunrise. The grooms and stable boys had abandoned their posts hours before, leaving the animals, tethered but restless. From within, a faint clatter of dishes might have suggested breakfast, yet it was impossible to distinguish whether the noise belonged to the living or if it was merely the manor settling under the weight of its own decay and the relentless heat pressing in from outside. No one answered when Lady Isabel Langley called from the hall. She had been awake long before the sun, watching the shadows lengthen across the marble floors, the walls bending ever so slightly under the oppressive warmth. She pressed her hands against her temples and listened, straining to hear the soft steps of her children, the rustle of servants, anything that might indicate someone remained alive within the manor's walls. But all that greeted her ears was a strange, uneven hum, vibrating through the beams and floorboards, a pulse, like the manor itself was breathing in a fevered rhythm. She walked from room to room, trailing her fingertips along the furniture. Dust that should have lain settled for weeks now clung to surfaces, stirred only by her movement. Her eyes darted to the kitchen, where pots still sat over a cold fire, spatters of congealed fat glistening in the dim light. The smell of old bread mingled with the metallic tang of sweat and the faint, sour hint of illness that had already penetrated the household. No flames flickered in the hearths, yet warmth radiated from the very air, thick, oppressive, inescapable. Outside, the gardens sagged beneath the sun, flowers wilting instantly in the heat. The fountains, intended to cool the air, lay still, their waters thick with algae and heat-warmed, stagnant. The stone statues lining the walkways seemed to lean inward, as if the house's opulence itself sought to protect something, though from whom or what remained unclear. Lady Isabel climbed the grand staircase slowly, pausing on each step as a cold sweat clung to her skin despite the stifling warmth. Portraits of ancestors stared down from the walls, faces stiff and painted in oils centuries old, eyes seemingly following her, silent witnesses to the collapse that had overtaken the household. The children's rooms were empty, beds unmade, toys scattered and forgotten. A doll lay on its side, its eyes glazed and its mouth open, a perfect echo of the silence pressing through the manor. A sudden, harsh noise, the crash of a chair from the library, made her start, heart hammering. She rushed to the room, but the space was empty, save for the overturned furniture, as if some invisible hand had moved through it in a fit of impatience or cruelty. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. The heat pressed down, unrelenting, and even in the grandest chambers, the manor seemed to sweat with the presence of the disease that had already taken the city outside its gates. Lady Isabel sank to the floor in the main hall, pressing her hands over her ears. Every bolt of the house, every shuttered window, every sealed door could not keep it out. The sweat had come for them already, its invisible hand curling around the entire estate, carrying the scent of fear, heat, and decay into every corner. And in that oppressive stillness, Lady Isabel understood, with a sinking certainty, that the manor had become a tomb not yet sealed but already filled. No one would answer, no one would return, and the house would hold its silence until the fever claimed it too. By mid-morning, the priory at St. Aldhelm's, normally a bastion of quiet prayer and disciplined labor, reeked with a scent that was both familiar and perverse. Vinegar, usually used to cleanse stone and cloth, now mingled with the metallic tang of sweat, the faint rot of hastily discarded bread, and the acrid perfume of fear itself. It clung to the walls and floors, rising in thick, suffocating waves that made even the monks' ritual breaths shallow and uneasy. Brother Martin knelt before the altar, fingers clutching the carved wood so tightly his knuckles ached. The church, meant to be a sanctuary, was smothered in stillness, the candlelight flickering fitfully in the thick, oppressive air. He breathed in slowly, then tried again, but each inhalation drew in heat and dread alike. Outside the small, shuttered windows, London pressed in with its stench of fever, sweat, and decay, as though the city itself had turned its gaze upon the monastery. The prior, Father Edmund, shuffled down the aisle, robes damp and clinging. His once proud gait slowed to a tremulous waver. His face was drawn, eyes glassy, lips cracked from the stifling warmth. He paused at the lectern, staring at the open missal, but the letters seemed to swim on the pages, warping in the heat. He whispered a prayer, but it hung in the thick air like smoke that refused to rise. "Brother Martin," he said, voice low and strained, "light the vinegar, wipe the altars, clean the stones." Martin obeyed, though his motions were sluggish. Each step felt like wading through invisible molasses. The brine of vinegar ran down his hands in sticky rivulets, combining with the sweat that plastered his hair to his forehead. He scrubbed the altar with trembling hands, aware that each movement was futile. The scent of the liquid, meant to purify, now seemed to echo the city outside, sour, sharp, and insistent. From the infirmary wing of the priory came a faint moan. A novice, lying on a pallet, shivered violently, soaked through with sweat that dripped onto the straw beneath him. Martin's stomach knotted at the sight. His hands faltered over the altar as he realized the plague that haunted London had entered their walls. Not the plague they had studied from dusty tomes or learned about in cautious whispers. It was faster, sharper, crueler. Father Edmund knelt beside the novice, pressing a damp cloth to his brow. The boy's pulse rattled beneath the cloth like the frantic beat of a bird trapped in a cage. He coughed violently, a wet, rasping sound that echoed through the empty nave. Martin's breath caught. There were no more herbs left that could heal him. No prayers strong enough to halt what had come. Outside, the bells tolled unevenly, carried on a warm, stagnant wind that pressed through the shutters like fingers probing for weakness. The sound vibrated through the walls of the priory, mingling with the smell of vinegar and the heavy, oppressive heat. Even the stones seemed to hum in response, as if the building itself were aware that the city it sheltered had become a grave. The monks worked in a frantic rhythm, cleaning, praying, trying to summon order in a house overtaken by chaos. Each movement stirred the thick air, releasing it in waves of oppressive heat that clung to their robes and skin. Sweat ran down their faces in thin streams, dripping into their sleeves, leaving darkened stains like ink on the fabric. By midday, St. Aldhelm's had become a tomb alive with quiet suffering. Candles burned low in the stagnant air, their flames quivering in the unnatural heat. The scent of vinegar was no longer purifying but oppressive, a reminder that even sanctity could not shield them from the city's fever. And outside, beyond the priory walls, the sweat prowled. It carried the voices of the dying, the echoes of abandoned streets, and the subtle, almost imperceptible rhythm of the city itself, all drawn into the suffocating stillness of London, creeping through cracks, under doors, and into every desperate breath of those who remained. The priory, once a refuge, now smelled of fear and decay, and the monks, no longer able to ignore it, understood with quiet, unspoken horror. The city's sickness had followed them here. By the fifth evening, the roads from London into the surrounding shires were haunted by the steady, clattering approach of riders whose presence carried nothing but dread. They moved with urgency, yet carried no light of hope. The sun had long vanished beneath a thick veil of fevered haze, leaving the streets darkened with a heavy, suffocating glow that clung to the cobblestones. The wind, if it could be called wind, blew sluggishly, stirring dust and the faint copper scent of blood mixed with sweat. Every step of the horses against the hard-packed dirt seemed to echo like a warning. The first rider appeared on the horizon of Chelmsford Road, a solitary figure silhouetted against the smoky sky. His cloak clung to him in sodden folds, darkened by the heat, soaked in sweat, his mount straining with each weary stride. In the basket of his saddle hung missives, the written voice of London now stained with terror, detailing the city's swift descent into fever, the collapse of markets, and the flight of merchants and servants alike. He carried news that should have provided clarity, but instead only deepened the fear. Behind him came more, forming a ragged column. Constables, clerks, and town criers, all driven by duty and desperation, their faces pale and glistening. Their horses were restless, stamping and pawing at the ground, their hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones that glimmered like fleeting stars in the oppressive gloom. The riders had no lanterns, none dared light fire in a world already smothered by heat, as if flames might draw the disease itself. The villagers, huddled behind shuttered doors, peered through narrow cracks. Mothers clutched children close to their chests. Fathers pressed their foreheads against cold stone walls. They had learned long ago that the city's fever was not a force to bargain with, not a spirit to placate. It was inevitable. And yet, the riders brought it in black ink on parchment, stamped with the authority of the city they had fled. Each message, a confirmation that the danger had followed them here, relentless and patient. One rider, a young clerk from the city proper, gasped as he arrived at the first manor. His face was pale, streaked with grime and sweat. He tried to shout over the heat, tried to call the steward, the master of the house, anyone who might listen. But the house was empty, the gates were bolted. Even the servants who had not yet fled were too frightened to answer. His words caught in his throat as he realized that no matter how he delivered the warnings, no one could act in time. At the second estate, a gentleman's daughter leaned out of a small shutter, her eyes wide in disbelief as a rider handed her father's steward a parchment that detailed the collapse of London's trade, the deaths piling in the streets, the fever spreading faster than any remedy could be administered. She heard him gasp as he read the words aloud. Merchants abandoned, servants fled, physicians overwhelmed, city gates locked, bells tolling unevenly, a catalogue of horror. By twilight, the riders had dispersed, leaving behind only the faint echo of hooves and the smell of sweat, leather, and iron. Their message was clear. London had become a fevered heart. pumping death outward into every village, manor, and cottage. The roads were empty again, save for shadows flickering in the dim glow of the sickly sky, and the villagers understood, with grim clarity, that the heat, the sweat, the relentless fever that had stalked the city had followed them home. No door, no gate, no shutter could bar it now. The riders had brought only bad news, and the land waited, heavy and silent, for the sickness to arrive. By the 6th morning, the villages around Essex and the northern outskirts of London had begun to resemble graveyards before their time. The sweat had spread with relentless, invisible persistence, and those who remained had taken to digging feverishly. Shovels struck the earth again and again, the metallic clang of iron echoing across empty lanes, carrying a hollow rhythm like a funeral drum. Women, men, and children alike moved with a frantic desperation, hands blistered and backs bowed under the weight of dirt, their faces streaked with sweat and dust, eyes wide and unseeing as the heat pressed down from the sky. At Holstead, a small hamlet lined with timbered cottages and narrow streets, the churchyard had grown into a forest of mounds, each fresh and uneven. The grave diggers, mostly peasants pressed into labor, worked with trembling hands. Their breath came in harsh gasps, mingling with the hot, stagnant air that carried the sickly odor of sweat, vinegar, and decay. The smell clung to their clothes, their hair, their skin, a constant reminder that the sweat was not distant, it was beneath their feet, in the soil itself. Old Barnaby Creel, the village's sexton, knelt beside a mound, hands pressed together in prayer over a freshly dug grave. His fingers were caked in earth and sweat, the latter pooling at his wrists and dripping into the soft soil. He muttered prayers in Latin, some for the living, some for the dead. He did not know which were which. Each day, more bodies arrived than could be counted, the living already trembling with the early signs of fever, and the dead rising only in memory and story. Children ran between the mounds, carrying baskets of straw for the graves, their small hands slick with sweat and mud. Their laughter was hollow, eerie, carried only by the wind and the faint rattling of shutters along the cottages. When they paused to watch a shovel strike the earth, their wide eyes reflected the same terror that had gripped every adult in the village. No one spoke of hope. There was only the rhythm of digging and the oppressive heat that refused to lift. A merchant from London, who had fled the city in the early hours of the outbreak, arrived at the village road, clutching a sack of coins that had lost all meaning. He gasped for breath, his body slick with the sweat of panic and exhaustion. He saw the mounds, rows of freshly turned earth, the grass flattened and trampled by feet that had no paws, and understood immediately that no sanctuary awaited him here. He turned back toward the road, only to see more villagers arriving from other hamlets, each carrying shovels, each with faces pale and eyes wide with fear. The sweat had followed them all. There was no escape. Inside the church, Father Gregory, an elderly man with hands shaking from both age and the stifling heat, tried to administer last rites to those who had already collapsed. His voice, once steady and commanding, now wavered, each syllable a rasp. The smell of incense, meant to purify the air, was overwhelmed by the metallic tang of fever and the sweet, sickly scent of sweat from bodies piled in the nave. He could not keep up. He could not even begin to imagine how many souls the village had lost, and how many more would fall before the day ended. By noon, the village had become a cacophony of shovels, ragged cries, and the faint hum of the sick. Every mound added seemed only to acknowledge that the land itself had turned against them, holding the weight of both bodies and fear. The sky above shimmered in oppressive heat, clouds heavy and motionless, offering no relief. And as the villagers worked without pause, Barnaby Creel paused once, glancing over the rows of graves. Each mound seemed to pulse faintly beneath his hands, as though the sweat had already claimed dominion over the soil. He shivered, wiping sweat from his brow, and whispered to no one in particular, "We dig too many graves, yet death still comes faster than the earth can hold it." The village dug and dug, but it was never enough. The sweat was patient. It was hungry, and it would not wait. By the 7th morning of the sweat, the great halls of London and Essex had begun to empty, not by orderly retreat, but by a frantic, desperate exodus. The nobility, who had always ruled from the shadows of their carved oak ceilings and polished stone floors, found themselves unable to command even their own households. Among them was Lord Percival Hawthorne, a man accustomed to authority, whose lineage stretched back centuries, and whose wealth could bend merchants and servants alike to his will. Yet even he, faced with the invisible hand of fever pressing through the streets and into the walls of his manor, faltered. It began in the early hours, before the sky had fully opened to the day. Percival awoke, drenched in sweat, despite the chill that lingered in the stone corridors of his hall. He had felt the heat press against him in his sleep, not merely the warmth of summer, but something oppressive, animate, almost sentient. He sat upright in his gilded bed, the sheets clinging to his back, breath rasping. Outside, the city lay quiet, unnervingly so, save for the faint tolling of distant bells, uneven and broken in rhythm, echoing the fear that had gripped the entire population. His servants, pale and trembling, had begun to vanish even before he had opened his eyes. Chambermaids and cooks whispered nervously as they moved through the hallways, leaving the silver and fine linens behind in their haste. Footmen fled first, their polished shoes striking uneven rhythms on the stone, echoing in the empty corridors long after they had disappeared into the haze of the streets. Percival tried to summon them, shouting their names through corridors now empty, but the only reply was the faint, quivering echo of his own voice. He dressed quickly, clothing clinging damply to his skin, and descended into the hall where once the family gathered for morning meals. The table was set, untouched, and the food had begun to spoil in the heat. A silver tray, still holding the remnants of the previous night's feast, was slick with condensation and the metallic tang of iron. Percival's stomach tightened, though not from hunger. The manor itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the sweat, walls groaning under the heat, doors sweating in their frames, and floors warm to the touch, as if the earth beneath had risen to meet the fever. Outside the great double doors, Percival paused, listening. He could hear nothing of life, only the subtle, oppressive weight of heat pressed into the street. Occasionally, a faint shuffle, a cough, or the rattle of a shutter reminded him that the plague had already begun to claim London's people. He swallowed hard, hands shaking, as the rational part of him argued to stay, to command, to protect, but instinct screamed louder. The sweat did not wait. It would not be bargained with, bribed, or reasoned into submission. He descended to the stables and found the horses restless, nostrils flaring in the thick air. The grooms had fled, leaving them tethered but sweating, their flanks glistening like wet bronze. Percival mounted the largest of them, heart hammering, eyes scanning the empty lanes. He had not looked back, not at the manor, not at the servants. He could not. As he rode through the early morning mist that shimmered with heat, the manor behind him seemed to sag in the weight of its emptiness. Windows stared like blind eyes, doors sealed like tombs, corridors stretching into silence thick enough to suffocate memory. The bells of St. Giles and St. Martin tolled unevenly, discordant echoes of the city's suffering. Percival felt their vibration in his chest, a reminder that the sweat had followed every step, every heartbeat, every decision. By the time he crossed the bridge toward the open roads, the streets were abandoned. London had emptied itself. Servants had run, merchants had vanished, citizens had bolted doors and shuttered windows. Percival Hawthorne, lord of wealth and land, found himself utterly alone. His authority, his power, his heritage, all meaningless against the invisible, patient cruelty of fever and heat. The sweat followed him, patient and relentless, threading the air behind his mount as the city's bells tolled into the growing haze. The Lord had fled his hall, but the plague had not fled with him. It would meet him wherever he went, and he understood, with a grim certainty, that the roads offered no sanctuary. London remained behind, empty yet alive with fever, watching, waiting, and ready to claim all who dared to leave. By the 8th morning, the markets of London, once vibrant arteries of trade, chatter, and clamour, had transformed into empty corridors of unease, steeped in a palpable, almost tactile dread. The stalls, once lined with vibrant cloth, fragrant herbs, and freshly baked bread, now sagged beneath the oppressive weight of the day's heat. The air, thick with the metallic tang of sweat and the sharp, sour bite of decay, clung to everything, curling through narrow lanes and suffocating any hope of normality. At the centre of Cheapside, a single stall still displayed its wares. Apples, pale and glistening, their skins slick with condensation that shimmered unnaturally in the morning light. The merchant had fled hours before, leaving a leather pouch open, coins scattered and tarnished from the lingering heat. The smell of fear hung in the air, heavy and pungent, mingling with the faint, sharp scent of rotting produce. No bird chirped, no horse neighed. Even the Thames, distant and murky, seemed to hold its breath. A woman, dressed in a faded blue gown, stepped cautiously into the square. Her name was Margaret Fenwick, and she carried a basket of washed linens, hoping to trade for food before the fever overtook her own household. Each footstep echoed in the empty square, unnaturally loud against the oppressive silence. The market, once a place of life and human rhythm, now exhaled an uncanny stillness, broken only by the faint creak of an abandoned cart shifting in the heat. Margaret paused mid-step. Her eyes darted from stall to stall, noting the remnants of hasty flight. Overturned baskets, scattered coins, rotting bread, and crates of vegetables crushed and steaming in the relentless heat. The air itself seemed aware of her presence, pressing close, curling around her neck and shoulders as if warning her to flee. She clutched her basket tighter, knuckles whitening, and whispered a prayer under her breath. In the distance, a child cried, alone, carrying nothing but a small loaf of bread. The sound shattered the silence but immediately faded, as though swallowed by the thick, unmoving air. Margaret turned toward the noise, but the streets were empty. Only shadows twisted across walls, distorted by the shimmering heat rising from the cobblestones. She shivered, even though the sweat ran freely down her back and soaked the fabric of her gown. A sudden movement caught her eye. A dog, gaunt and trembling, emerged from an alleyway, fur-matted, eyes wide with terror. It sniffed the ground, sniffed the air, and then bolted into the shadows. Margaret's stomach knotted. The animals, like the humans, knew what she did not yet fully comprehend. Fear had taken physical form in the city, trailing every living being, pressing into their skin and infecting the air. She moved from stall to stall, gathering what she could: apples, a few vegetables, a loaf half-molded at the edge of a wooden tray. The items felt sticky in her hands, as though the market itself exuded a dampness that clung to flesh. Every basket she touched seemed to pulse faintly, echoing the fevered rhythm that now marked the streets. Above her, the bells of St. Mary-le-Bow rang erratically, tolling unevenly in the heavy air. Their sound did not comfort. It mocked. It reminded her that London was no longer a city of trade or commerce, but a city under siege by an unseen enemy, one that no coin could bribe, no prayer could appease, and no locked gate could keep out. Margaret paused in the center of the square, basket clutched to her chest, sweat dripping into her eyes. The smell of fear was everywhere, from the cobblestones to the abandoned stalls, from the sun-warmed wood to the faint iron tang in the air. The market had become a mausoleum of commerce, echoing with the absence of life and the presence of terror. The sweat had arrived, patient and implacable, and it carried with it the truth Margaret understood at last. The city's heart, the market, the people, the very streets themselves, was dying, and the heat that followed every living thing would not stop until it had claimed them all. By the 9th morning, the fevered wind carried pilgrims from distant villages into London. though the city itself seemed to recoil from their presence. They came barefoot along dusty roads, feet blistered and raw from heat-warped stones, dragging worn cloaks and rattling rosaries in their trembling hands. They walked with the weight of desperation pressing upon their shoulders, each step a muted plea for mercy, each breath a prayer swallowed by the thick, motionless air that clung to the streets like wet wool. At the outskirts of the city, near Aldgate, a group of 10 pilgrims paused to rest. Their sandals had long since been discarded in favor of bare feet, and their clothing threadbare, soaked with sweat, hung in clinging folds, darkened with the night's heat. A thin, coppery scent hung over them, mingling with the metallic tang of the road, the sour decay of abandoned provisions, and the ever-present, nearly tangible smell of fear. Brother Anselm, a young man from Canterbury, knelt on the sun-baked cobbles, pressing the palm of his hand against the stones. They radiated a heat that seemed alive, pulsing faintly beneath his fingers. He shivered despite the warmth, feeling as though the earth itself had taken a fever and now exhaled it back into the world. "Do you think God is watching?" whispered one of the women in the group, voice quivering. Her eyes were wide, reflecting both the brightness of the hazy morning and the raw terror of their pilgrimage. Brother Anselm said nothing. He could feel it in the very air, the city itself, alive with fever, waiting to claim them. London exhaled, thick with heat and despair, and the bells rang unevenly, distorted by the heat haze that blurred the skyline. Their tolls echoed across the empty streets, a rhythm out of sync with time itself, each clang a warning carried across the fevered city. They moved onward, feet scraping against sun-scorched stone, passing abandoned stalls where apples had begun to rot, where coins lay tarnished and worthless. The market's scent had changed from trade to decay, wafting faintly toward them, curling around their legs, clinging to the hems of their robes. Even the animals that had survived fled from the roads. Dogs howled from shuttered yards, cats slunk beneath carts, birds twisted unnaturally in the air before vanishing. At a small chapel along the way, the pilgrims stopped, pressing their hands against the rough stone of its walls. Inside, the altar was empty, the scent of old incense mingling with the metallic tang of the city's fever. The pews were dusted but uncleaned, the candles melted into uneven shapes. They kneeled, murmuring prayers, tears running down sunburned cheeks, though the air was too thick for comfort. Even here, in a place of supposed sanctuary, the heat pressed against them, carrying the whispers of the sick, the echoes of collapsed bodies, the tremor of empty streets behind walls no longer inhabited. One pilgrim, an old woman with a knotted shawl, bent to touch the cold stone floor. Her fingertips left damp streaks as sweat and moisture from the stone mingled. She muttered, "The city itself is ill. Even its bones are burning." They left the chapel and resumed their pilgrimage, each step slower than the last, each footfall leaving a faint, dark imprint on the hot cobblestones. Behind them, the city waited silently, breathing the heat, pressing it forward, following their every move. By noon, the pilgrims were scattered along the road, some clutching each other for support, some falling to their knees, overcome by the unrelenting fever that followed them like a shadow. London exhaled in waves of oppressive warmth, thick enough to choke, carrying the scent of fear, sweat, and decay down every lane, every alley, every empty street. The city's heart had become a fevered furnace, and the pilgrims, barefoot and trembling, walked straight into its grasp. By the 10th morning of the sweat, the quiet of Essex and the smaller villages surrounding London had been consumed by the relentless, methodical work of the living burying the dead. Graves multiplied like shadows in the hot sun, shallow mounds of freshly turned earth stretching across churchyards, fields, and any patch of open ground deemed suitable. The villagers dug feverishly, spades striking soil that had grown dry and brittle from the oppressive heat, the metallic tang of iron and the acrid scent of sweat hanging thickly in the air. In Little Headingham, the churchyard resembled a battlefield of the dead before battle had truly ended. Fathers, mothers, and older children worked with trembling hands, eyes wide with both exhaustion and terror. Each burial was hurried, each grave dug shallow to accommodate the number of bodies arriving faster than the earth could bear. Some of the deceased were wrapped in hastily sewn linen, others left only in blankets, the smell of decay rising quickly under the sun's oppressive glare. Every mound glistened faintly, slick with the fevered sweat of those who had handled the bodies, merging human warmth with the earth itself. Elderly Barnaby Creel, the sexton, knelt beside a fresh grave, pressing his calloused hands to the earth as if willing it to accept the body within. Sweat ran from his temples in rivulets, soaking into the coarse wool of his tunic. His hands were raw from labor, yet he dug relentlessly, each strike of the spade marking both necessity and despair. He whispered prayers as he worked, though he could not tell if they were for the living, the dead, or for himself. The scent of vinegar from disinfecting herbs mingled with iron, dirt, and the sour tang of sweat, creating a pungent cloud that clung to the lungs and eyes. Children ran between the mounds, carrying straw to line the graves or water to soak the soil, their small bodies already slick with sweat. Their laughter, hollow and brief, sounded unnatural in the stifling air, an echo of joy that had no place in this fevered landscape. Even their play was tinged with death, mimicking the hurried, careful movements of the adults as they tried to dig faster than the sweat could claim another. In one corner of the churchyard, a woman collapsed onto the edge of a grave she had been filling. Her shawl clung to her back, soaked through with her own sweat. She pressed a hand to her forehead and gasped, eyes darting to the next mound as though it were moving. She could feel the city's fever in her veins, press against her chest, make her limbs heavy and uncooperative. She tried to rise, but the weight of heat and exhaustion held her prone. Another villager helped her to her feet, only to stagger themselves, unsteady, their own breath harsh and shallow. The distant tolling of church bells, uneven and discordant, punctuated the rhythmic strikes of shovels against earth. The bells did not offer comfort. Their uneven tones mirrored the irregularity of life and death in the village. Every chime seemed to pulse through the soil, through the bodies, through the fevered air, as though calling the sweat forward, keeping time with its invisible march. By noon, the churchyard had transformed into a landscape of human effort and desperation. Mounds stretched in every direction, each a testament to the city's and the countryside's collapse. The air was thick with heat, damp with sweat, and saturated with the scent of the dead. Shadows of the living moved among them, bending, shivering, and collapsing, pressed down by the oppressive weight of labor and the fevered world around them. Barnaby Creel paused at the center of the yard, glancing over the rows of graves. He wiped his brow, leaving a dark smear on his forearm, and muttered, "The earth can only hold so much. The sweat will not wait for stones or prayer." The villagers continued to dig. They could not stop, and the sweat patient, invisible, unrelenting, watched, waiting, and claimed more with every silent, suffocating breath. By the 11th morning, the sun had climbed higher than any living soul could endure, casting a merciless, orange-gold light over the city and the surrounding villages. The sky itself seemed to resist the natural passage of time, locked in a heavy, molten glow that pressed down like an iron lid upon the world. The air shimmered in wavering waves, distorting the outlines of timbered houses, tilted chimneys, and deserted streets. Every stone, every plank, every patch of earth radiated heat back into the world, creating a suffocating bubble that no shadow, no wall, and no shelter could pierce. In the heart of London, the streets were empty, except for the faint silhouettes of those too weak or too desperate to flee. A solitary merchant stumbled across Cheapside, clutching a satchel of unsold cloth, his face pale and glistening with sweat. Each step seemed heavier than the last. The stones beneath his feet radiated heat, burning the soles of his worn shoes. The air pressed against his chest, thick, warm, and sour, carrying with it the smell of sweat, iron, and the faint, sweet tang of decay. He stopped mid-stride, swaying, and felt his pulse hammer in his temples as though the city itself were pounding against his skull. In a narrow alley, a young boy leaned against a shuttered door, sobbing softly. His clothes clung to his small frame, soaked with sweat from the night before and the oppressive heat of the day. The air vibrated faintly around him, a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to echo the rhythm of the fever spreading through the city. He wiped at his eyes with a grimy hand and swallowed, tasting salt and dust, wondering if he would live to see nightfall. Above the city, the sky refused to shift. Clouds that might have promised shade or rain were heavy, swollen, and motionless, hanging like low, molten ceilings. Even the wind, the rare, welcome breeze, had failed to stir. Every rooftop, every courtyard, every open market felt the same oppressive pressure, as though the heavens themselves were pressing London into submission. The bells of distant churches rang unevenly, tinny, distorted, their sound absorbed into the thick, hot air, carrying the dissonant rhythm of panic and despair. In St. Giles Parish, a mother knelt over her children, pressing damp cloths to their burning faces. The sweat poured freely from their small bodies, soaking into the linen, dripping onto the floor, mixing with dust and the metallic tang of nearby coins. She whispered prayers that seemed swallowed by the dense, motionless air. Outside her window, the streets shimmered, vacant and eerie. Shadows moved in strange ways across the walls, distorted by heat and fear alike. Along the riverbank, the Thames lay like a ribbon of molten glass. Its water did not cool the air, it radiated warmth instead, reflecting the heat of the sun and the fevered pulse of the city. Boats floated, abandoned, tethered, but empty. The faint ripple of water, lapping against hulls, was drowned by the hum of heat and the distant, irregular tolling of bells. The river, which had long guided the life of London, now carried only the weight of stagnation and foreboding. In the manors and cottages surrounding the city, families pressed against walls, windows, and doors, praying that the thick, relentless heat would spare them. But it did not. It seeped through cracks, crept under shutters, and settled on skin like molten glass. The fever had made the city its furnace, and no one could escape its slow, inescapable grip. By noon, the city lay trapped beneath the molten sky, streets deserted, markets abandoned, and the air shimmering with the invisible presence of the sweat. Every breath brought heat, every step pressed against the pavement that glowed underfoot. The sky, relentless and immovable, refused to cool, and London, baking, trembling and silent, waited, knowing that the fever that had begun in the alleys, the manors, and the markets would not relent until it had claimed everything in its suffocating, invisible embrace. By the 12th morning, the relentless oppression of the sweat had begun to falter, not because it had left, but because the sun itself had shifted, offering a fragile reprieve that London had not known in days. The sky, once molten and unyielding, softened to a pale, trembling gold, and a faint breeze stirred, carrying with it the scent of damp earth from the riverbanks. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the city felt as though it could breathe, though the air remained thick with the lingering tang of sweat, iron, and fear. In the narrow streets of Cheapside, those who had survived the first wave emerged cautiously from shuttered houses. The cobblestones glistened with residue, a mixture of rainless dew, dried sweat, and the fevered moisture of bodies long abandoned to panic. Children crept along the edges of the street, toes brushing the uneven stones, eyes wide with tentative hope. Their mothers, skirts clinging damply to their ankles, carried baskets of food salvaged from once-abandoned stalls. But even in this tentative revival, the city did not feel safe. The memory of fever and collapse pressed upon every shoulder like a shadow that refused to lift. At St. Mary-le-Bow, the bells had begun to toll again, but differently this time. Their clangs were measured, deliberate, almost cautious, no longer uneven or frantic, but deliberate reminders that life had returned, though fragile. From the tower, the faintest sigh of wind carried the sound across the streets, and Londoners paused, some dropping to their knees, heads bowed, fingers pressed to eyes in silent gratitude. In a small courtyard near Lombard Street, Thomas Hensley, a merchant who had survived by locking himself behind doors and avoiding human contact, stepped cautiously outside. His tunic, still damp with sweat from the prior days, clung to his frame as he adjusted his wide-brimmed hat against the newly softened sunlight. He surveyed the streets with wary eyes. Doors hung open, some for the first time in days. Crates and baskets remained, remnants of hasty flight and abandoned trade. A dog nosed through one, sniffing at the lingering scent of rotting apples. Thomas exhaled slowly, feeling the faint relief of the cooler air against his neck. Beyond the city, along Essex lanes, villagers who had spent hours digging graves paused in their work. The soil, previously baked dry under the unyielding sun, felt cooler beneath their hands. Fresh air wafted in from the distant hills, carrying the subtle scent of damp grass and faint, lingering smoke from the hearths. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the land felt less like a furnace and more like a living thing that had survived the fever's siege. Inside St. Aldhelm's Priory, the monks stirred cautiously. Candles guttered gently as the cooler air seeped through narrow window slits. Brother Martin pressed a damp cloth to his forehead, feeling the first traces of comfort in days. Father Edmund exhaled slowly, glancing over the infirmary where so many had succumbed. The sweat had spared no one completely, but now it had at last eased its relentless grip. And yet, London remained fragile. The streets that had been abandoned still bore the traces of fever. Sweat-stained doors, overturned carts, empty markets, and graves newly filled with the bodies of the weak. The air, though cooler, was still thick with memory, the smell of iron, the faint tang of decay, and the lingering pulse of the city's terror. For now, the heat had broken. The city could breathe again. Windows opened cautiously. Children laughed in hesitant bursts. Merchants counted their scattered coin. But London would not forget. It had survived the fever, and it had learned that even when the sky softens, even when the air grows breathable again, the shadow of the sweat remains waiting in the alleys, in the streets, and in the memory of every trembling heart. By the 13th morning, the city lay heavy with silence, though the oppressive heat that had gripped it so mercilessly had at last begun to lift. Windows creaked open for the first time in days, admitting the faintest whisper of wind, carrying the scents of damp straw, river water, and the distant earth beyond the city walls. The survivors emerged slowly, cautiously, as if afraid that motion might summon the fever back, or that their own voices might shatter the fragile relief. They had lived, yet they could not speak, not of what they had endured, not of the streets slick with sweat, of the markets abandoned, of the bodies stacked in hastily dug graves. In a narrow lane near Bishopsgate, a woman named Agnes stood at the threshold of her house, hands pressed to the doorframe for support. Her skin was still damp with sweat from the night before, her hair clinging to her temples in dark, wet strands. She had lived through the fever, yet each breath carried the memory of the neighbors who had not. She exhaled slowly, shivering despite the warmth of the morning sun. The lane itself was empty, silent, and thick with the lingering scent of decay. Apples lay rotting in a spilled crate. A dog prowled listlessly, its fur matted and eyes wide. The city smelled of fear, sweat, and memory all at once, and Agnes pressed a trembling hand to her chest, as though that alone might hold the shadows at bay. At the church of St. Giles, the survivors gathered quietly, not to pray, but to witness each other's presence. Faces were drawn, eyes hollow, hands shaking. The pews, warped by heat and humidity, groaned under their weight. Candles guttered weakly, smoke curling in lazy spirals toward the ceiling. No one spoke, Words had become too dangerous, too heavy, too inadequate. To name the fear was to summon it again, to breathe life into what had almost destroyed them. Father Edmund of St. Aldhelm's Priory walked among the survivors who had arrived from the surrounding villages. He touched shoulders lightly, whispered a blessing in a language so old it sounded like wind over stones. Yet even he could not say the words aloud that truly mattered. The city had been ravaged, lives had been stolen, and the sweat had claimed the weak before the strong had time to cry out. He could only lead them in silence, their feet shuffling over the stone floors, the heat still clinging to the air like a living thing. On the riverbank, near the Thames, survivors paused to look across the water. Boats lay abandoned, their hulls slick with condensation. The surface shimmered in the morning light, reflecting the haze that still lingered over the city. They saw the faint outlines of streets empty, alleys darkened, and rooftops warped in the heat. Their breaths came slowly, as though the act of inhaling might disturb the memory embedded in the stones, the cobbles, the very air. Even in their survival, they could not forget. The sweat had burned its memory into every corner. The glisten of sweat on walls, the overturned carts in silent markets, the soft mounds of graves dug too quickly, too shallowly. The survivors had lived, but they had emerged from the fever carrying it in their bodies, their eyes, their very presence. Words could not capture the heat, the terror, the relentless oppression of days in which life and death had balanced so precariously. Agnes turned from the lane and pressed a hand to her mouth, watching a child step cautiously across the street. The boy's small feet left faint imprints on the warm cobblestones, echoes of life amid the ruins. Yet even his laughter, if it came, would be quiet, careful, measured. The survivors could speak of daily tasks, of food and work, of small mercies, but they could not speak of the sweat, not aloud, not to each other, for the memory burned hotter than the fever had, and silence had become the only refuge. London survived, but it had been scarred in ways that could never be unspoken. By the 14th morning, the outskirts of London and the villages beyond were dotted with the grim monuments of a city undone. Mass graves, shallow and unmarked, heaped with bodies hastily interred beneath fevered hands. The earth itself seemed to recoil under their weight, the soil clinging to shovels and hands alike, slick with moisture, dark and pungent with the heat and decay that clung to it. A heavy wind carried the scent outward, iron, sweat, and the faint, lingering odor of rotting flesh. Those who walked near the graves did so with hesitation, dragging each footstep as if the ground itself demanded reverence or warning. In East Smithfield, the churchyard had become a forest of hastily dug mounds, stretching across the green, as though the earth itself had been forced to accommodate the living and the dead at once. A lone cart sat at the edge, overturned and abandoned, its wheels half buried in loose soil. The driver had fled, leaving behind a trail of footprints that led into the village, then vanished entirely. A few crows flitted above, wings trembling in the thick air, landing briefly on the graves and tearing at stray remnants of cloth or straw. Their cries sounded almost human, carrying a hollow cadence that mixed with the low, irregular tolling of distant bells. Old Father Thomas, the parish priest, moved cautiously between the mounds. His hands shook beneath the sweat-soaked sleeves of his cassock, a trembling gesture against the oppressive warmth that pressed from both earth and sky. He pressed a cloth to his brow and bent over a mound, muttering a prayer he had whispered for decades but now felt inadequate against the sheer scale of death surrounding him. He could see the outlines of corpses beneath the thin layer of soil, the slight rise of a shoulder, the curve of a head, and he shivered, even in the oppressive heat. Nearby, a young woman from the village, Margaret Hensley, carried water to the freshly turned earth, trying to ease the digging for the weary laborers. Her fingers were raw, her arms slick with sweat. She paused to look over the mounds, eyes wide and unblinking, absorbing the scene of motionless bodies heaped in quiet rows. Each grave was an echo of London, a testament to a city too consumed by fever and panic to care for the order of burial. leaving the living to work feverishly to honor the dead in a world that no longer offered reason. A child, no older than 10, crept behind a man digging a grave, eyes wide and filled with both fascination and fear. The boy's tiny hands were damp with sweat, his bare feet leaving dark impressions in the hot soil. He whispered questions that went unanswered. "Is this all the people? Will they ever come back?" The man shook his head, pausing to press a hand to the child's shoulder. "They are gone," he said quietly, voice hollow. "We dig so the earth can hold them, but they are gone." The wind shifted slightly, carrying the faintest hint of smoke from pies, a nearby cottage. Ash and heat mingled in the air with the odor of the graves. The sound of shovels striking earth echoed through the still morning, a grim, rhythmic percussion that seemed to mark time itself. The villagers worked with the precision of exhaustion, each mound filling the silence between each breath, each strike a muted protest against the inevitability of death. As Father Thomas knelt once more to bless a fresh grave, he glanced across the field. The sky shimmered in waves of heat. Though the sun had not yet fully risen, the mass graves stretched endlessly, each mound a reminder that London had survived, but not unscathed. The living had claimed no mercy in the city streets, only space in the soil. The sweat had left a scar not merely on flesh, but on the very land, and no prayers, no ceremony, no words could undo it. Those graves would remain unvisited, forgotten. Yet they bore witness to a city's fever, a people's fear, and the slow, relentless hand of death that had moved through the streets with the patient cruelty of inevitability. The earth held them, silent and unyielding, as the survivors continued to toil beneath the shimmering, heavy sky, knowing that the memory of this day would outlive all who labored here. By the 15th morning, London's wealthy few, who had fled to the countryside or remained hidden behind bolted doors, had begun to communicate with the outside world through letters. But these missives were no longer the careful, precise correspondence of a city functioning under law and trade. They were desperate instruments of deception, hastily scrawled in ink that smeared under sweating fingers. Each line carried both fear and calculation, exaggeration to justify absence, omission to hide panic, lies to preserve authority that no longer had meaning. In a small manor near Stratford, Lord William Harrington sat at a polished oak desk, the surface slick with his own sweat. The candle beside him flickered weakly, barely illuminating the page before him. He dipped his quill into ink, the fluid glinting under the dim light, and began to write. The letter was addressed to a cousin in London, a man who had survived thus far but who needed reassurance that order still prevailed. Harrington wrote of markets opening soon, of servants returning to their duties, of the city's officials maintaining governance. Every word was a lie, chosen deliberately to create a semblance of control where none existed. Outside, the heat pressed against the manor walls. Even the stone seemed to sweat, droplets forming along the edges of windows and clinging to the carved mouldings. Harrington wiped his hand across his brow, smearing ink and moisture together, the smell sharp and metallic. Each breath he drew carried the stench of sweat and dust, mingled with the faint sourness of unwashed cloth. The manor felt alive in the fevered air, walls pulsing faintly under the oppressive weight of the city's suffering, as though the bricks themselves remembered every collapse, every moan, every death in the streets. In another house, Lady Margaret Fane bent over her own letter, instructing a steward to inform neighbours that all was under control. Her handwriting shook in the heat, uneven, lines crossing one another as if the paper itself were resisting the deception. She described the city as calm, the markets as orderly, the physicians as competent. She did not mention the smell of sweat that clung to the hallways, the overturned furniture, the abandoned carts, or the soft, unmistakable moans of those who had not survived. The letter was meant to reassure, to preserve dignity, yet every word rang hollow in the heavy, suffocating air of her own home. At the post house near Cheapside, letters arrived in bundles, tied with fraying string, many already damp from the sweat-laden air. Clerks sorted them mechanically, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to consider the dishonesty stitched into every line. Each missive carried a pretense. Merchants were still trading, orders were being filled, city gates were secure. The reality, however, was starkly different. Streets were deserted, markets abandoned, and London itself had become a city of silent terror, its pulse slowed only by the fever of the survivors. In a small cottage along Fleet Street, a widowed woman read the letters aloud to a group of neighbors. Their eyes widened as they listened, but disbelief colored their reactions. They had walked the empty lanes, smelled the air heavy with sweat and decay, witnessed the piles of hastily dug graves, and felt the pulse of the city's fear in every abandoned doorway. Each reassuring word in the letters rang false. The paper could not mask the reality that had already been etched into the stones, the earth, and the memory of those who remained. Even as they folded the letters and set them aside, the survivors understood the truth. These documents were not messages of hope, but tools of survival for those who had fled. Lies offered a shield for the powerful, but left the city and its people to carry the weight of the sweat alone. London might receive news of order and calm, but every street, every house, every market testified to the chaos, the terror, and the fevered death that had passed through, leaving nothing untouched. The letters promised normalcy, and yet the city, slick with sweat and memory, whispered only of the lies they concealed. By the 16th morning, the royal court had assumed a carefully crafted pretense. All was well. Windows were opened to let in the heatless breeze, tapestries were straightened, and candle flames were coaxed to flicker evenly across polished floors. Yet beneath the veneer of composure, the court was a city adrift in fevered memory, each whisper, each glance, each measured movement, echoing the chaos that London and its surrounding shires had endured. The sweat had claimed its victims, but the court moved forward as though no shadow had fallen. King Henry VIII, broad-shouldered and still formidable, sat at his dining table in the Whitehall chambers. His gold-trimmed robes clung damply to his skin, sweat had slicked his hair to his forehead, yet he smiled faintly at the courtiers around him, maintaining the illusion of strength and order. He raised his cup of watered wine, the liquid lukewarm from the room's oppressive heat, and toasted to prosperity, law, and divine favor. The courtiers returned the gesture, though their hands shook and their eyes darted toward the windows. Outside, the city shimmered in the morning haze, streets empty, markets deserted, bells tolling in irregular patterns. The smell of fever lingered faintly on the breeze, metallic, sour, and unmistakably human. Yet inside, the court feigned ignorance, continuing its routines with rehearsed gestures and measured conversation. The king's smile masked a heartbeat thrumming too fast in his chest, a pulse that mirrored the invisible, lingering presence of the sweat. Lady Anne, seated beside the king, dabbed at her temple with a damp lace handkerchief. Her skirts clung heavily to her calves. The perfumed fabric could not disguise the heat pressing through the hall. She offered compliments to the chamberlain with a voice light and airy, yet her eyes, scanning the polished floors and the blank expressions of other nobles, betrayed the panic beneath the courtly mask. Every movement was careful, calculated, as though any misstep might expose the hidden fear that had gripped even the highest ranks. In the corridors beyond, servants moved quietly, carrying trays of food or polished silverware, careful not to collide or spill. Their own bodies glistened with sweat, each step a careful negotiation with gravity and exhaustion. Some whispered hurriedly to one another about missing relatives, about abandoned stalls, about the piles of bodies they had glimpsed in alleys or churchyards. Each word was measured, muffled by the fear that the court could not know, that their rulers must remain unshaken, untarnished by knowledge of the mortal toll outside the palace gates. From the tower, a bell tolled, uneven and broken in rhythm. The sound drifted faintly into the hall, bouncing off stone walls, echoing in the ears of those assembled. The courtiers ignored it, though the slightest flinch betrayed their attention. They had grown accustomed to such disruptions, omens in sound, reminders of the city's suffering that could not be fully silenced. By midday, a faint breeze moved through the open windows, but it brought no relief. The air was warm and thick, heavy with memories of heat, of collapse, of the sweat's relentless march. The courtiers continued their rituals. Letters were sealed and sent, chambers were inspected and polished, wine poured and tasted, protocols rehearsed. All was as it had always been, or at least as it appeared to be. But behind the mask of normality, the court was hollow. The city beyond had changed irreversibly. Streets remained empty, homes remained shuttered, markets remained deserted. London had survived the sweat, but the court had survived by pretending it had not happened. And in that pretense, the court preserved its authority, but at the cost of truth. The city, heavy and fevered, waited silently outside the palace gates, aware that the court's mask could not undo what had been lost, could not revive what had perished, and could not shield anyone from the lingering shadow of the sweat. Life inside continued, polite, rehearsed, and unbearably still. But the city remembered. By the 17th morning, the city's healers, those who had once carried the pride of learning in their hands and the authority of knowledge in their speech, found themselves powerless, defeated by the invisible cruelty of the sweat. Apothecaries and physicians alike gathered in small, overheated chambers, their parchment-strewn desks bearing the traces of fevered work, hastily scrawled observations, sketches of symptoms, formulas mixed with desperation. Yet no amount of ink or study could alter the unyielding truth. The fever moved faster than their remedies, more subtle than their treatments, more patient and insatiable than their craft allowed. In a narrow room of St. Bartholomew's infirmary, Master Thomas Rooke bent over his notes, the candle beside him flickering weakly in the heavy, stagnant air. Sweat trickled down his temples, glistening in the dim light, and dampened the corners of his carefully folded parchments. He traced his finger along lines of observation, the ink smeared and clotted from constant handling, but it brought him no solace. His patients, those he had barely managed to tend, had succumbed in hours, faces pale, eyes glassy, bodies slick with fever, shivering or burning in cruel alternation. Beside him, his assistant Marjorie laid a hand on his shoulder, trembling herself. "Master Rooke, what good is this?" she whispered. "The remedies, the records, they cannot help them. None of it can." Rooke did not answer. He stared at the page as if it might speak to him, might whisper a solution hidden between the carefully penned lines. But there was nothing. The fever had no respect for theory, for observation, for centuries of study. It respected only bodies, only heat, only the unrelenting march of mortality. Across the room, another physician, Master Edward Marlowe, tore up a sheet of parchment in frustration. Each shred's whisper seemed louder than the city outside, echoing in the stagnant chamber like a death knell. Observations, formulas, herbal recipes, everything rendered meaningless in the presence of the fever that had claimed so many and spared so few. He stared at the fragments of inked notes, scattered like fallen leaves, and realized that knowledge, painstakingly accumulated, had been no shield against the city's wrath. Outside, London simmered under a sky that had softened only slightly, the oppressive heat lingering in every stone, alley, and shuttered window. The scent of iron, sweat, and faint rot carried faintly into the infirmary through the open doors and broken shutters. Patients moaned softly on straw pallets, their breaths shallow, their skin glistening with the fever's relentless touch, and the physicians could do nothing but watch. Rooke rose to his feet, pacing between tables, his robe sticking to his back. He touched the cold stone of the window frame, seeking comfort in the solid, unyielding material. But the stone was warm from the sun, from the heat of the sweat, from the countless bodies it had claimed. Every inhale brought the metallic tang of illness into his lungs, a constant reminder that the city's suffering was not distant, it was here, pressing in, alive in the air, and in every corner of the streets. Marjorie knelt beside him, eyes wide. "We must do something," she said, voice cracking. He shook his head slowly. "We have done all we could, and it was nothing. Every note, every record, useless." The room fell into silence, broken only by the faint groan of the floorboards and the distant, uneven tolling of bells. Outside, the city continued its quiet, fevered rhythm, streets empty, markets abandoned, graves filling too quickly. Rook's hands hovered above the scattered notes for a final moment before he swept them into a pile, tearing each sheet deliberately. The fragments fell to the floor, fluttering faintly in the stagnant air like ashes from a fire long extinguished. For the first time, the physicians had no defense, no knowledge, no hope. The sweat had claimed its mastery, and the city waited, patient and unrelenting, while those who had studied its patterns bowed, powerless, before its invisible hand. By the 18th morning, the streets of London had grown eerily familiar and yet utterly alien, transformed by weeks of fever and flight. The sweat had passed through like a silent tide, leaving the city empty but scarred. Cobblestones glistened with lingering sweat and damp from hastily abandoned water. Stray coins lay tarnished in puddles of heat-warmed rainwater, and crates of spoiled fruit marked the remnants of a commerce that had collapsed under panic. The air carried a heavy, metallic tang, thick with memory, and the streets themselves seemed to pulse with a rhythm forged from absence, silence, and fear. Near the edge of Whitechapel, a boy named Thomas stepped carefully over a patch of cobbles, toes scraping against the smooth, slick stones. His clothes clung to him, damp and stiffened with heat and sweat. He glanced down alleys that once teemed with life and now held only shadow, dust, and the faint, curling scent of decay. The market stalls were empty, the goods rotting, where merchants had fled. A faint breeze brought the stench of spoiled apples, bread, and meat, mingled with the sharp iron tang of abandoned coins. Thomas shivered despite the warmth. Each breath tasted faintly of heat and loss. On Cheapside, a carriage stood abandoned in the middle of the street, its wheels spinning slightly as if unsettled by the faint tremor in the cobblestones. Its driver had fled hours ago, leaving no note, no explanation. Nearby, a merchant's stall, toppled during a hasty retreat, was slick with the residue of spilled flour and vegetables. A stray dog nosed through the debris, sniffing cautiously, ears pinned back. Even the animals, like the people, sensed the city's fevered memory. They moved with care, shadows among shadows, avoiding the spots where bodies had fallen or sweat had pooled, as though the streets themselves remembered. In a narrow alley near Bishopsgate, a group of survivors huddled behind shuttered windows. They whispered among themselves, recounting fragments of the city as it had been before the fever, as though naming the lost life might tether them to sanity. Yet the streets outside were quiet in a way that seemed unnatural. Not empty of sound alone, they were empty of reassurance, empty of continuity, empty of anything alive. A cart creaked faintly in the windless morning. A child's abandoned toy rolled slowly across the stones, and distant bells tolled unevenly, reminding all who could hear that London had not forgotten, even if the people tried to. On the riverbank, the Thames shimmered in the morning light, low and sluggish, reflecting rooftops warped by heat and chimneys that seemed to sag under the weight of smoke and exhaustion. Boats lay abandoned, hulls slick with condensation, their ropes slack, drifting lazily in the current. Occasionally, a gull cried, piercing the stillness, but the sound felt hollow against the city's memory. The river had seen the fever, had carried it silently, and it held the city's terror like a mirror to the emptiness of streets and the absence of human life. Even the wealthy had returned, but their presence felt tentative. They walked slowly, scanning the abandoned shops, shuttered doors, and scarred streets with wary eyes. They knew the city had been irrevocably changed. Every overturned crate, every dark stain on a doorstep, Every faint line of heat-slicked cobblestone told a story the letters from London could not. The city remembered what they had forgotten. Thomas paused in the centre of the lane, pressing a hand to the cool stone of the wall. The heat had softened, yet the weight of memory pressed against him, heavy as lead. He felt the streets themselves, cobblestones, walls, alleys pulse faintly, as though whispering the secrets of the sweat to anyone who could still listen. London had survived. The people had returned, but the streets would never forget. And as the faint wind carried the distant tolling of uneven bells, city seemed to sigh, still heavy with the fevered weight of absence, loss, and the memory of what had walked through its streets, unseen, unchallenged, unstoppable. By the 19th evening, when the sun had finally dipped behind the thick, smoke-tinted clouds and the city's streets began to cool, mothers across London and its surrounding villages remained awake, wide-eyed and unshaken from terror. They listened not for the ordinary creak of a floorboard or the distant barking of a dog, but for the subtle, invisible traces of the sweat that might linger in the night. Their homes, though physically intact, felt permeated by the fever that had swept the city, and their children, though asleep, bore the faint sheen of sweat that refused to dry, the lingering pulse of fever yet unclaimed. In a modest home near Spitalfields, Agnes Latham sat in a low-backed chair, her hands resting on the thin blanket that covered her youngest child. She had not slept for days, eyelids dry and burning, ears straining for any sound that might indicate the fever's return. Outside, the street was quiet, almost painfully so. The occasional sway of a shutter, or the store creak of a signpost sounding like a shout in the oppressive night air. Sweat clung to her back and shoulders, prickling along the nape of her neck, though the candle beside her flickered weakly, offering only feeble light against the heavy darkness that pressed into the room. Her daughter, Margaret, stirred in her sleep, face flushed and lips cracked. Agnes pressed a cool cloth to the child's brow, but the faint warmth beneath her fingers reminded her of what they had endured: the heat, the collapse, the bodies buried in haste, and the faint, lingering memory of those who had not survived. Each breath the child drew seemed too shallow, too rapid, a pulse echoing the rhythm of fear that had gripped the city. Agnes's own breath caught in her throat. Across the city, similar scenes unfolded. Women knelt at the edges of beds, holding infants, pressing hands to foreheads, rocking gently while their minds churned through memory and terror. In some homes, windows had been opened for the first time in days, yet the air carried the faint metallic tang of decay and sweat from streets, deserted yet still haunted by fevered traces. Their ears caught the faintest noises, the rattle of loose shutters, the irregular tolling of distant bells, the soft scuffle of a rat over cold tiles, and each sound stirred the same silent panic that had haunted them for nights on end. At St. Giles Parish, a group of mothers huddled in the corner, whispering cautiously about their own families, recounting which children had collapsed, which survived, and which could never be replaced. They spoke in fragments, each word chosen for silence, for subtlety, for the hope that acknowledgement might not summon the fever again. Their hands were damp, their faces lined with sweat and worry. The candles guttered in the thick air, casting shadows that stretched across walls and ceilings, merging with memories of panic and loss. Even the wealthiest homes could not escape this vigilance. In the great manors of Cheapside, women paced quietly through halls polished for display, pressing hands to the cool wood of window frames, listening to the empty streets below. They could hear nothing tangible, yet every gust of wind, every distant echo of a bell, seemed to carry the pulse of fevered memory. No one slept untroubled, no child was free from the shadow of heat and disease, and no mother could silence the echo of the sweat that lingered in every corner, every hallway, every shuttered window. By midnight, London seemed caught between two states, alive with cautious movement, and yet haunted by the spectre of fever that refused to leave. Mothers listened, eyes wide, hearts racing, hands pressed tightly to children's bodies. Outside, the city exhaled faintly, carrying the memory of heat, sweat, and death that had brushed against every wall, every stone, every street. And though the fever had ebbed in the daylight, it lingered in memory, in scent, in shadow. The mothers, silent and vigilant, knew the city had survived the sweat, but they would never forget it. The night had teeth, and they listened. By the 20th morning, the streets of London had begun to pulse again, not with the living, not with commerce, but with whispers, murmurs, and the invisible weight of memory. Though the first wave of the sweat had ebbed, leaving abandoned markets, empty halls, and mass graves as evidence of its cruelty, the city remained haunted. The survivors moved cautiously through alleys and courtyards, their eyes darting toward shadows, their hands pressed to doorknobs, their breath tasting faintly of fear. And with each step, rumors began to stir, carrying the invisible fever with them. In a narrow lane near Bishopsgate, a man emerged from his shuttered home, wiping sweat from his brow. He had survived the worst of the fever, but the heat from the previous weeks still clung to him, pressing against his skin, curling in his hair, seeping into his lungs with each inhalation. As he walked toward the market square, he exchanged cautious glances with another survivor. Words were scarce there, was no need for them. The rumors traveled faster than speech, carried on the tension in the air, the subtle twitch of a hand, the wary glance of the eyes. "They say it's returning," a woman whispered from the doorway of a nearby house, her voice catching on a sob. In Aldgate, they speak of sudden heat, bodies falling, children collapsing in their sleep. The man nodded grimly, feeling the air thicken around him. The heat might have softened in the light of morning, but its memory lingered like a scar. The streets themselves seemed to shiver under its weight, cobblestones glistening faintly with moisture that was not dew, that smelled faintly metallic, faintly sweet, faintly wrong. Every abandoned stall, every overturned cart, every shuttered window became a repository for rumor, each silent witness lending its weight to the whispers of returning fever. In the marketplace, a group of women gathered cautiously, glancing over their shoulders as they whispered about neighbors who had succumbed after the first wave, about the mass graves that remained, about the merchants who had fled and never returned. Each story seemed to carry the pulse of the sweat within it, a vibration that pressed into their skin and made their hands tremble. One woman clutched her basket tightly, her knuckles white. "I saw a child collapse near the docks," she said, fevered, eyes glassy. "They say it was the sweat returning." Nearby, a young man attempted to hang a lantern to illuminate the market's remains, but the heat shimmered through the air, making the light warp and flicker. He glanced down the street and saw a shadow move, too slow, too deliberate, like the fever itself taking form. The rumors had given it shape, breathed life into it, and now the city seemed to watch itself through those whispered stories, every alley and street corner waiting for the unseen hand of disease to strike again. Even the river reflected the unease. The Thames, once stagnant in heat, now shimmered faintly, carrying the reflections of rooftops warped by fevered memory. A small boat drifted aimlessly, and the faint ripple of water against wood sounded like a warning to anyone listening carefully. The bells of distant churches tolled again, uneven and discordant, echoing through empty streets, amplifying the whispers, lending weight to the rumors, as though the city itself had conspired to spread fear. By afternoon, the rumors had grown into a palpable presence, moving faster than any messenger, infecting conversation and thought alike. Survivors walked with hesitation, glancing at shadows, listening for coughs, measuring each step as though the heat might strike them down again. The sweat had returned, not yet visibly, not yet tangibly, but it had returned in memory, in fear, in the very air that clung to the city and its people. London had survived the first wave, but now it remembered, whispered, and waited, and the fever, patient and relentless, lurked within, every rumor ready to claim what was left. By the 21st morning, London bore the scars of the sweat like a body marked by fever. The streets, once vibrant with merchants and pedestrians, remained slick with memories of panic. Abandoned carts, overturned barrels, rotting produce, and the faint, persistent scent of sweat and iron that clung to every stone. The city had survived, but it could not forget. Its memory pressed against walls, seeped into floorboards, and lingered in every shuttered window. And despite the softened heat of morning, every breath carried the pulse of terror that had flowed through the alleys, markets, and manors like an invisible river of flame. In a narrow lane near Cripplegate, a young woman named Eleanor leaned against a wall, her hands pressed to the rough timber. She had survived the fever, but her skin still gleamed with the faint sheen of remembered sweat. She inhaled slowly, trying to gather courage to step into the street, but even the air itself seemed laden with recollection. The cobblestones glimmered faintly, warped and slick from days of oppressive heat, each one echoing with footsteps that had once hurried, stumbled, and fallen beneath the weight of panic. Eleanor shivered, despite the lightness of the morning. London remembered what the people wished to forget. At St. Mary-le-Bow, the bells tolled unevenly, their metallic voices broken and hollow. They had rung frantically in the first wave of the fever, warning and condemning in equal measure, and now their echoes served as reminders of a city forever changed. From the tower, a solitary figure, a bell-ringer too fearful to descend, pressed his hands against his ears and shivered as the tolls reverberated across deserted streets. Below, the marketplace was empty but for the scattered remnants of abandoned goods, crates of apples, baskets of wilted greens, and loaves of bread softened and cracked by heat. The scents mingled with the metallic tang of old coins, creating an aroma that lingered like a ghostly memory. In the manors, the wealthy moved through halls polished for appearance, but hollow beneath the surface. Windows were opened for ventilation, but the air remained heavy with the residue of panic. They walked carefully, noting the slight shimmer on the floors, the faint patches of dried sweat left by servants who had fled, and the small reminders that London had been racked by fear and fever beyond comprehension. Even their courtiers spoke softly, as though raising voices might awaken the city's memory to reclaim what it had already consumed. On the outskirts, the graveyards told the clearest story. Mounds of earth, hastily dug, stretched across fields and churchyards alike. Each hillock carried the weight of lives lost in hours rather than days. Faces and hands pressed into the soil with finality. The ground, baked and moist by turns, glistened faintly with the sweat of the living who had dug it, and the memory of the dead who lay beneath. Elderly sextons moved among the graves, pressing palms to cold stones, whispering prayers they did not believe. The sweat had passed, but it had left its mark on earth and memory alike. Eleanor stepped cautiously into the street, feeling the cobbles beneath her feet. The air shimmered faintly, the memory of heat lingering like a pulse. She pressed a hand to her chest, listening not for signs of the fever, but for the city itself, which seemed to breathe under the weight of its own recollection. London had survived, yes, but it remembered. Every alley, every abandoned cart, every shuttered window held traces of horror that could not be washed away. And so the city moved forward, cautiously, silently, haunted by the fever that had scorched it, by the fear that had gripped its people, and by the memory that refused to let the sweat be forgotten. The fever had passed, but the heat it left behind would linger in the bones of the city forever. London would survive, but it would never forget.